Christmas morning, a city in ruins, and a general chained to a wall, waiting to confess to crimes he never committed, broadcast live to the entire world. They said General Ethan Voss was a traitor. They said he sold secrets, betrayed soldiers, burned everything he swore to protect. They were wrong. He knew too much, so they buried him. But someone else knew the truth. Someone they already erased once before. Someone carrying a golden rifle and a grudge 5 years in the making. Subscribe now, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare look away. The cold came first, before the pain, before the sound of boots on concrete, before the thin yellow light that swung on a corroded chain above his head. The cold reached him, settled into his bones, and made itself at home the way cold does when it's been allowed to stay too long. General Ethan Voss had lost track of the days sometime around the second week. He knew it was December. He knew because the guards had started humming something low and tuneless. That might have been a carol, might have been a funeral march. The acoustics in the subterranean cell made everything sound like mourning. His wrists were raw where the chain cuffs had worn through the skin. He'd stopped flexing against them after the third day when a guard named Dobrescu, heavy-set, deliberate, the kind of man who took his time, noticed the effort and added a second set around his ankles just to make a point. The cell was 8 feet by 6. He'd measured it in the dark using the length of his foot. Concrete floor, concrete walls, a single drain in the center that smelled like rust and something older. The only furniture was the metal chair he was currently attached to and a bucket in the corner he wasn't going to think about. They gave him water twice a day. Food once, if they remembered. He'd been a general for 11 years. He'd commanded operations in 4 countries, overseen the extraction of assets from compromised networks, signed orders that sent men into situations with 30% survival projections, and then stood at their memorials afterward and kept his face still. He thought he understood what it meant to suffer the consequences of a decision made in the dark. He understood now that he had not. "Rise and shine, General." The door opened without ceremony. 2 men entered. Neither of them was Dobrescu. Dobrescu came alone and moved slowly. These 2 moved the way operators move, with economy and purpose, placing themselves at angles that cut off any improvised response before it began. One carried a metal tray with a pitcher of water. The other carried nothing, which meant he was the one Ethan needed to watch. Ethan kept his eyes level and said nothing. The man with the tray set it on the floor just out of reach. Standard, petty, the kind of small humiliation designed to accumulate over time. "Commander Vale wants a conversation this morning," the empty-handed one said. He had a slight accent Ethan couldn't fully place. Eastern European substrate under something flatter, American maybe, the kind of overlay that comes from years abroad. "He says to tell you the window is closing." "The window for what?" Ethan said. His voice was rougher than he expected. He needed to drink. "For the reasonable option." Ethan looked at the water pitcher, looked back at the man. "Tell Vale he can come down here himself if he wants to talk." The 2 men exchanged a look that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. The empty-handed one crouched down until he was at eye level with Ethan, close enough that Ethan could see the small scar below his left eye and the careful blankness behind his irises, the kind of blankness that isn't natural but is trained. "General," he said quietly, almost conversational. "I've watched men hold out in rooms like this for weeks. Good men. Decorated men. Men who genuinely believed the things they believed." He paused. "None of them made it to the confession with their stories intact. You understand what I mean?" Ethan understood exactly what he meant. "Get out," Ethan said. The man stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the water pitcher on the way to the door. When the lock engaged, Ethan sat in the dark again and listened to his own breathing and thought about what he knew, and whether knowing it was enough reason to survive. The city above him was called Black Ridge. 3 weeks ago, it had been called something else, a staging point, a logistics hub, a forward operating position that had served as the primary supply node for the northern corridor. Military cartographers had 17 different designations for it, across 17 different command layers, and none of them quite captured what it actually was, which was a city that had been gutted from the inside out over the course of a 6-month campaign that was itself the product of intelligence so comprehensively wrong that someone, somewhere, had to have made it wrong deliberately. Ethan knew this because he had been the one tasked with finding out why the intelligence was wrong. He'd started with the supply chains. found gaps that didn't line up with battlefield damage assessments, traced the gaps backward through 3 layers of procurement, and found, at the base of it, a contractor whose paper trail dissolved the moment you applied any serious pressure to it. Behind the contractor was a series of shell accounts. Behind the shells was a classified budget line that had been allocated to a program called Project Eclipse, which did not appear in any directory Ethan was cleared for. He'd pulled the clearance for Project Eclipse using a code that technically still belonged to him from a previous posting. The moment he accessed the file, 14 seconds of reading, long enough to understand the broad architecture of what he was looking at. His security access was revoked, his communications were flagged, and within 48 hours he was on a transport to Black Ridge for what his orders described as a command assessment visit. The assessment had lasted approximately 20 minutes before men in vehicles without markings surrounded his convoy, and his escort team was taken down with a precision that suggested significant preparation. He'd been underground ever since. He pressed the back of his head against the cold concrete wall and stared at the light bulb and ran through the math again. What he'd seen in the 14 seconds, what it implied, what it would take for someone at the right level to look at the same information and understand that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that was actually being fought. Commander Marcus Vale had authority here. That much was clear from the way the guards deferred, from the communication equipment Ethan had glimpsed during the one occasion he'd been moved through the main corridor. But Vale was not the ceiling. Vale was the implementation layer. Someone above Vale had the clearances to create Project Eclipse, to fund it through channels that required 4-star cooperation, to ensure that rescue attempts consistently arrived at empty positions or walked into ambushes. Someone above Vale was leaking the rescue routes. Every time military search teams mobilized toward Black Ridge, they hit either a prepared ambush or found nothing where Ethan was supposed to be. He'd heard, through fragments of guard conversation, that 2 helicopters had gone down, that a special operations team had lost half its number in a trap that required foreknowledge of their approach vectors. Ethan had good people looking for him, people who knew their business. They weren't finding him because someone with better information kept moving the pieces before they arrived. He closed his eyes, thought about his wife, Elena, who would be doing what Elena always did when he went dark, keeping busy, staying level, preparing for the worst while hoping for something different. They'd had an argument 3 days before the convoy, about his obsession with the procurement discrepancies. She'd said you don't have to be the one to fix every broken thing, and he'd said someone does, and she'd looked at him with that particular expression she reserved for moments when she knew she was right, and he wasn't going to listen. He thought about his daughter, Maya, who was 7, and had informed him at Thanksgiving that when she grew up she intended to be either a marine biologist or a jazz drummer, and possibly both. He thought about what it meant to die underground in a chair, in a city that didn't have a real name, for reasons that wouldn't be admitted to, for a truth that would be buried with him. Then he stopped thinking about it, because despair was not useful, and he had already decided he was not going to give Marcus Vale the satisfaction. Upstairs, in what had been the Black Ridge Municipal Administrative Building, and was now Vale's Field Command post, the morning briefing was running behind schedule. Commander Marcus Vale stood at the head of a table covered in maps and printouts, and did not show his impatience because showing impatience in front of subordinates created problems that compounded over time. He'd learned that early. He was a man who'd been learning things early his whole career, promoted fast, decorated often, trusted by the kind of people who needed a competent instrument they didn't have to think too hard about. He was 39 years old and had spent 17 years being the person who made things happen so that other people could take credit for the things happening. He was tired of it in a way he hadn't fully processed yet. "The broadcast window," he said. "Where are we?" The comms officer, Sergeant Talia Wren, sharp, perpetually underslept, pulled up a schematic on the wall display. "Satellite uplink is confirmed for 0600 Christmas morning. We have a 40-minute window before the military frequency band cycles. Everything goes out on the civilian overlap channels simultaneously. Every major network feed, every streaming aggregator that pulls from the international press pool." "And Voss?" "Conditioning is ongoing. He's not—" Wren paused, chose her words. "He's not cooperative." "He doesn't have to be cooperative. He has to be present and audible." Vale studied the schematic. 40 minutes is sufficient. The confession script is prepared? Drafted. Legal reviewed the language. Legal. Vale said the word the way you might say a word in a language you don't speak, flat and uncertain about the connotations. Fine, 40 minutes is sufficient. The moment he finishes the statement, we cut the uplink and proceed with the secondary order. Nobody asked what the secondary order was. They already knew. Vale walked to the window. Outside, Blackridge lay under a skin of gray December sky, the buildings stripped and hollowed, some of them still showing smoke damage from the campaign's early phase. A pair of soldiers crossed the plaza below, weapons slung, moving with the particular listless quality that characterized men who were guarding something they couldn't explain to anyone. His phone vibrated. He looked at the message. Movement detected at the northern perimeter. Possibly wildlife. Possibly not. He read it twice, then put the phone in his pocket. Double the perimeter rotation, he said to no one in particular, and tell the overnight watch I want a full sector report by noon. Wren marked something on her tablet. Vale went back to the maps. She came up through the river. Not the main channel. The main channel was monitored, had been since the first week of the operation. Thermal sensors every 40 meters, with a 90-second sweep cycle. She came up through the drainage tributary that ran underneath the Eastern Industrial District, a concrete channel barely wide enough for a body and completely invisible on any aerial survey because it didn't show up as a waterway on the maps. It showed up as a maintenance conduit. She'd read the maintenance records. 3 years old, municipal, filed before the campaign started, back when Blackridge was still a city rather than a concept. She'd read them twice and then memorized the relevant sections and then burned the copies. The water was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. She knew this because she'd checked the weather data before entry and because she could feel it in her extremities with a clarity that was not quite pain, but would become pain if she allowed it to. She didn't allow it. She moved through the conduit on her back, weapon wrapped in a waterproof sleeve across her chest, pack secured tight enough that it barely shifted when she rotated her hips to navigate the bends. Total time in the water, 22 minutes. She'd given herself a 15-minute margin. She used 11 of it. When she surfaced in the drainage basin at the base of the Eastern Industrial Block, she lay flat in the shallow overflow pool and waited for 4 minutes without moving. Listened, counted, evaluated. No footsteps. No radio chatter within immediate range. A generator running somewhere to the northwest. Steady cycle, not tactical. Probably HVAC for the command post or the prison block. She rolled to the edge, cleared the basin's concrete lip, and pressed herself into the shadow beneath a corroded loading dock. Then she pulled back the face covering and breathed. Her name, her real name, was not Viper. Her real name was a thing she had not said aloud in 5 years, because there was no one left to say it to, and because the person who carried it was technically dead, listed in a classified after-action report as KIA during a failed extraction in circumstances that the report described as operationally sensitive and left otherwise unaddressed. She was 34 years old. She'd been doing this, the part of this that happens in the dark, in conduits, in cities that don't have real names, since she was 22. She had a facility for it that she'd never found a comfortable way to describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The particular kind of calm that descended when a situation became dangerous enough, the way everything else fell away, and what remained was just geometry and timing and the next decision. She unslung the weapon from the waterproof sleeve and checked it in the low light by feel. The rifle was a customized .338 Lapua Magnum build on a precision chassis she'd had fabricated 3 years ago by a gunsmith in a country she wasn't going to name, who'd asked no questions because she'd paid enough that questions were not part of the transaction. The receiver had been refinished in a pale gold anodizing that she hadn't requested but had arrived that way, and she'd kept it because it didn't reflect light and daylight conditions despite what intuition might suggest, and because it had, over time, through operations she also wasn't going to name, become a kind of identifier. People who'd seen it and survived referred to it as the golden rifle. She preferred not to think about the people who'd seen it and hadn't survived. She ran a function check, confirmed the suppressor threading, and settled into a stable position against the dock wall to begin her first observation phase. The intelligence on Blackridge had taken her 2 weeks to assemble. She'd started from a fragment, an encrypted transmission she'd intercepted through a receiver she maintained in a location. She rotated every 90 days, one of 7 dead drops she kept active across the continent as a matter of professional hygiene. The transmission was tagged with a routing code she recognized from an operation she'd been part of, and then erased from, 5 years prior. The routing code meant someone was using the same infrastructure she'd used. That infrastructure was supposed to be dead. She'd broken the encryption in 4 days, which was faster than the last time she'd worked with this cipher family. The content, once decrypted, was not a military communication in any conventional sense. It was a logistics update. Supply quantities, vehicle counts, personnel rotation schedules for a location designated Bravo Sector 7, which was not a designation she recognized from any current operational order of battle she had access to. She'd cross-referenced the supply quantities against known military provisioning standards and worked backward to estimate the prisoner population that would require that level of intake. The math suggested between 1 and 3 high-value detainees. She'd sat with that for a day. Then she'd pulled the news feeds for the previous month and found the gap, the carefully managed absence of information about General Ethan Voss, who had been visiting the Northern Corridor on an assessment mission and who had not been heard from since. The military communiques described an ongoing search operation. The language was careful, neutral, the kind of language that has been reviewed by someone whose job is to manage inference. Ethan Voss was not a name she was indifferent to. She knew him, not personally. She'd never served directly under his command. But 5 years ago, when she'd been trying to surface what she'd found about the procurement corruption and the network of officials who were profiting from manufactured conflict, Voss had been one of 3 people at the relevant command level who she'd assessed as uncorrupted. One of 3 people who, if she'd been able to reach them with the evidence before the mission was burned, might have done something with it. She hadn't been able to reach him. The mission burned anyway, and she'd spent the following 5 years doing the work she could do from the position of someone who officially did not exist. Now, someone had Ethan Voss in a subterranean cell, and the routing code on their communications matched the infrastructure she recognized from the people who had burned her. The geometry of it was not subtle. She broke into a military satellite uplink relay station in week 2, small installation, skeleton staff, located in a mountain range 200 kilometers from Blackridge, and spent 40 minutes reviewing transmission logs before the duty officer's rotation brought someone back to the console. What she found in the logs confirmed the supply intelligence and added a date. Christmas morning, 0600, a broadcast. She'd packed her kit that night and driven through the dark toward Blackridge. From the loading dock, she had a clean sightline to the eastern face of the municipal building and to a section of the perimeter fence approximately 300 meters north. She could see 2 guards on the fence rotation. Their intervals were consistent, 7 minutes between passes, which suggested a fresh assignment and a watch commander who was still maintaining discipline. Sloppy operations let guard intervals drift. Disciplined ones kept them tight. Vale was running a disciplined operation. She noted it and adjusted her assumptions accordingly. She spent 90 minutes on the observation phase, not moving from her position except to shift her weight twice when the cold in the concrete began to compromise sensation in her left knee. She mapped 3 guard positions, 2 vehicle patrol routes, and the likely location of the comm center based on the antenna configuration on the municipal building's roof. She tracked the generator cycle and identified the backup power line running along the eastern exterior wall. She also found the thing she hadn't expected to find: a second layer. Beneath the visible security architecture, the guards, the vehicles, the perimeter fence, there was a network of sensor installations that were not military standard. They were better than military standard. Embedded in the rubble at irregular intervals small enough to miss on casual observation, the kind of placement that suggested someone had thought carefully about the difference between detection and the appearance of detection. She'd found them because she was looking for exactly this kind of thing. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure that anything approaching Blackridge from any direction would be detected, cataloged, and responded to before it got close. Not the standard precaution of an isolated field commander. This was the security posture of an operation that expected a specific kind of threat. An operator. A single actor working outside official channels. They were expecting her, or someone like her. She filed that away and kept watching. The third thing she found, at the end of the 90 minutes, was the prison block entrance. It was not marked. It was accessed through what appeared to be the sub-basement of the logistics annex building, a separate structure connected to the municipal building by a covered walkway. The only reason she identified it was because she saw a guard rotation emerge from what should have been a sealed access point, and the second guard was carrying a food tray. She pulled a grease pencil from her kit and made a small mark on the concrete beside her. a habit from early training she'd never entirely shed, physical notation as backup to mental cartography. Then she began constructing the approach sequence for tonight. She had 4 objectives in order of necessity. First, determine Voss's precise location within the prison block. Second, identify the broadcast equipment and its power source. Third, find evidence. Not just Voss evidence. Voss alive, but the evidence destroyed accomplished nothing. The people running Project Eclipse would surface the confession under different branding, with different witnesses, and the architecture would survive. Fourth, extract. 4 objectives, 18 hours, 1 rifle, and the small matter of a security layer that was already watching for her. She settled in against the dock wall, regulated her breathing to a pace that would let her rest without sleeping, and waited for darkness to develop properly. 3 hours later, she found the supply manifest. It had been transmitted through the uplink relay she'd compromised. A secondary document attached to a routine logistics update, probably flagged for encrypted delivery and accidentally bundled with the open channel traffic in a clerical error. The kind of mistake that happened when an operation was running fast and the administrative tail was struggling to keep up with the operational head. The manifest listed material consistent with a long-term detention facility. But the line items at the bottom were not detention supplies. They were broadcast equipment specifications, satellite uplink hardware, high-definition camera arrays, audio processing systems with real-time noise cancellation, and a notation in a shorthand she had to read twice to parse. Eclipse, primary delivery, target, asset statement, capture, timeline advance to 0600 Christmas. She read it a third time. Timeline advance. It had been moved up. The original plan had given her until December 26th. Sometime in the last 72 hours, someone had decided to accelerate the schedule. She checked her watch. 16 hours and 40 minutes to 0600 Christmas morning. She'd built her entire infiltration timeline on the assumption she had until the 26th. She had route sequences planned, distraction timings mapped against the guard rotations she'd observed over the past week of aerial surveillance. All of it calculated against a date that was no longer operational. She pressed the back of her head against the dock wall and stared at the underside of the loading platform above her and did not swear, because swearing was a way of releasing pressure she needed to keep. 16 hours. She picked up the grease pencil and crossed out the existing approach sequence she'd marked in the concrete and started over. At 100 hours, she moved. She crossed the Eastern District in 11 minutes using rubble coverage and 3 choke points she'd pre-identified as camera dead zones. The sensor network watched the open approaches, not the clutter corridors where structural collapse had created irregular sightlines. The people who'd placed the sensors were good, but they'd placed them in positions that made sense from an external approach perspective, not from the inside of the rubble field. She thought about that as she moved. The design sensibility was consistent with someone who'd trained in conventional security architecture and adapted it to a field environment. Smart, but not unconventional. They were expecting a threat that moved like a threat was supposed to move. She didn't move like that. She reached the covered walkway at 2114 and pressed herself into a gap between the walkway's exterior wall and a collapsed section of the adjacent structure. The gap was 14 inches wide. She was 12 inches in kit. The math worked, barely. From inside the gap, she had a partial view of the walkway entrance and a direct sightline to the logistics annex access point she'd identified during the afternoon phase. She waited. At 2127, a guard emerged from the annex access point, stopped to light a cigarette, and stood in the covered walkway for 6 minutes before going back inside. She clocked him, noted the time, let the pattern develop. At 2142, a second guard did the same thing. Different man, same cigarette break, same approximate duration. Security detail rotation using the walkway as a smoking point. Not on their assigned schedule. This was personal time, boredom, the ordinary human behavior that occurred in the gaps of even well-run operations. The watch commander either didn't know or was choosing not to know. She filed it. At 2201, she was inside the annex. The sub-basement was concrete and fluorescent lighting on a half-dimmed overnight setting. 2 corridors intersecting at a right angle, 4 visible doors. She could hear the generator clearly from here. It was running the lights and something else, something with a heavier draw, probably the climate system for the broadcast equipment. She moved down the left corridor first because left was the direction the tray-carrying guard had come from that afternoon. The third door on the left had a different lock than the others. Higher grade, recent installation, the kind of hardware you added when you were retrofitting a space for a purpose it wasn't originally designed for. She went to work on it. 4 minutes. Longer than she wanted, shorter than she'd feared. Inside was a corridor of cells, 6 doors, heavy gauge, all with the same retrofitted lock hardware. One door had a thin line of light underneath it. She moved to it, listened, breathing. One person. Slow, controlled, not sleep breathing, the breathing of someone managing discomfort consciously. She tapped the door twice, waited. Silence on the other side. She tapped twice more, then once, then 3 times. A sequence that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been trained in the same communication protocols that JSOC had been using in the mid-period before the methodology revision. A long pause. Then, from inside, low and hoarse, "That's a 12-year-old authentication code." She almost smiled. "I know," she said quietly. "It's the only one we share." Another pause, shorter this time. "Who is this?" She considered the question, considered what answer was most useful. "Someone who read the Project Eclipse file," she said. Silence. Then, "They said you were dead." "They said you were a traitor," she replied. "We're both having a bad year." The breathing on the other side changed quality slightly. Not relief exactly, but the particular recalibration of someone who has been operating on a fixed set of assumptions and has just been handed a variable. "The broadcast," he said. "You know about it." "That's why I'm here." "There are documents." His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not panic, not quite. Something that had been compressed for a long time under significant pressure. In the command post upstairs, physical files and a local server. "If you can get to the server before—" "I know," she said. "I've seen the manifest." A pause. "You've been here before tonight?" "I've been watching for a week." A longer pause. She could almost hear him processing the timeline, recalculating. "The execution is after the broadcast," he said. They want me alive long enough to read the statement. After that, I know." "So you have a plan?" It wasn't quite a question. "I have an approach," she said. "Plans require more certainty than I currently have." A sound from the other side of the door that might, in different circumstances, have been a short laugh. "General Ethan Voss," he said. It wasn't an introduction. It was more like he was reminding himself. "I know who you are, General." "I don't know who you are." She put her hand flat against the door for a moment, an impulse she didn't entirely understand. "You will," she said. "Get some rest. I'll be back before 0400. She was 3 steps back down the corridor when she heard his voice again through the door, quiet enough that it might have been meant for no one. "Merry Christmas." She stopped, just for a second. "Yeah," she said. And then she moved back toward the annex corridor, toward the stairs, toward the command post and the server, and the documents that could end a war nobody was supposed to know was happening. Well, the command post on the 3rd floor was occupied. She'd expected a reduced overnight crew, 2, maybe 3 people, maintaining watch on the comms systems and the broadcast equipment while the primary staff rested before the 0600 go time. What she found when she reached the 3rd floor and pressed herself against the corridor wall. Outside the main operations room door was 4 voices in ongoing conversation, which meant either the overnight crew was larger than anticipated or Vale had brought the morning shift in early. She listened at the door for 90 seconds and separated the voices by cadence and position. 4 people, 2 near the main console, 1 by the window, 1 moving, pacing probably, or working the satellite system in the back section. 4 was workable, but 4 moving in an unpredictable pattern was a problem. She needed 3 to 5 minutes at the server terminal she'd identified from the exterior antenna configuration. It would be in the back section, near the uplink hardware. The person working that area was the mobile one, which meant she'd have to either time her entry around their movement or introduce a variable. She pulled a small device from her kit. It was a frequency emitter about the size of a cigarette lighter, capable of producing a short burst on the emergency comms frequency used by perimeter security teams. If someone at the main console heard a burst on that frequency, the protocol response was to contact the perimeter supervisor directly, which required moving to the main console and initiating a verification call. It wouldn't hold all 4 of them. but it might consolidate them. She set a 10-second delay, placed the device at the base of the corridor wall 12 feet from the door, and moved back to the stairwell. The burst fired. She heard the shift in conversation inside, the instant uptick of attention, the voice at the window saying something sharp, someone moving toward the main console. She counted to 4 and went through the door. 2 people at the main console, both with their backs partially to her, both focused on the display. The person who'd been by the window was now crossing toward them. The mobile one was still in the back section, but had stopped moving and was looking toward the front of the room. She had approximately 2 seconds before the mobile one's angle of view would include the door she'd just come through. She moved left, keeping below the console bank, reaching the rear server terminal, in a low crouch that she held steady, despite the burning in her left knee from the cold water earlier. The terminal was unlocked. Overnight, active session, someone had been accessing logs and hadn't locked the screen when they moved. Amateur hour, and she was grateful for it. She pulled a data drive from her kit and slotted it. Started the copy protocol she'd preloaded. It was set to prioritize by file size, pulling the largest packages first on the assumption that the physical evidence would be in consolidated archives rather than scattered documents. 30 seconds into the copy, one of the people at the main console said, "False alarm, nothing on the perimeter." Another voice, "Run it back anyway. Vale wants full documentation on all frequency anomalies." Yeah. She watched the copy progress indicator. 40%. The drive was fast, but the files were large. She was looking at another 90 seconds minimum. The mobile person in the back section started moving again. She went flat behind the server rack as the figure, a woman, she noted, young, wearing headphones around her neck, walked past within 4 feet of her position and reached for something on the shelf above the terminal. A coffee mug. The woman picked up the mug, looked at the active terminal screen for a moment, and for 1 second that stretched like a wire under tension, she paused. The copy indicator reached 62%. The woman at the terminal looked at the screen, looked away, took a drink from the mug, walked back toward the front. The wire tension released by fractions. 78%. 91. Complete. She pulled the drive and was at the door in 4 seconds flat, threw it in 5, in the stairwell in 7. She'd been in the room for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. She pressed the drive against her chest beneath her jacket and stood in the dark of the stairwell and made herself breathe. Then she checked her watch. 3 hours. 5 hours and 37 minutes to the broadcast window. She still had to get back to Voss, get him out of the cell, get him through the annex, through the Eastern District, to the extraction vehicle she'd staged 2 kilometers out. And she still hadn't found the physical files. She looked up the stairwell toward the 4th floor. The physical files would be in Vale's personal office, which meant they were 1 floor up and 30 feet from the room she'd just left. She thought about Voss in the cell, the chain cuffs, the bare light bulb, the bucket in the corner. She thought about what the files represented. What happened to everyone involved? To every soldier who died in a war that had been manufactured for someone's balance sheet? If those files stayed in this building and the building was destroyed on Christmas morning? She went up the stairs. Vale's office was locked with a keypad. She had a bypass device for standard military keypad configurations, which this was not. This was a commercial security product, civilian market, the kind of thing you sourced privately when you needed security that wasn't in any military procurement database. Smart. Annoying. She spent 90 seconds examining the frame and found what she was looking for. The installation was recent enough that the installer had cut a corner on the conduit routing, leaving a 3-centimeter gap between the keypad housing and the door frame that she could work with. 5 minutes of careful work with tools she carried in a kit the size of a deck of cards. The door opened. Vale's office was organized in a way that suggested someone who thought in categories. The desk was clear except for a single manila folder and a secure tablet in sleep mode. The filing cabinet in the corner had a physical lock rather than a keypad, which told her the high-value material was in the cabinet, and the folder on the desk was either working documents or decoys. She photographed the folder contents first. Operational orders, clean and professional. Nothing that would be explosive on its own, but potentially useful as connective tissue. The cabinet lock took 3 minutes. Inside were 7 physical folders, each labeled in a numbering system she didn't immediately recognize. She photographed all of them, 43 pages of documents, a mix of financial transfer records, communication logs, and what appeared to be a personnel file for a project administrator she didn't recognize. The last item in the cabinet was not a folder. It was a small hardbound journal, the kind you bought at a stationery shop. Handwritten, dense, careful script. Someone who was accustomed to putting things on paper that couldn't go anywhere else. She photographed every page. It took 9 minutes. When she was done, she replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, relocked the cabinet, and closed the office door behind her. 4 hours and 43 minutes. She went back down to the sub-basement, back through the cell corridor, back to the third door on the left. She tapped twice, once, 3 times. A pause, shorter than before. "Tell me you got something," Voss said. "I got the server contents and Vale's physical files." A longer pause. "How long have you been up there?" "About an hour." "And they didn't—" "No." She heard him exhale, slow, controlled, the kind of exhale that carries a significant amount of compressed tension with it. "Okay," he said. "Okay." And then quieter. "Are we getting out of here?" She was already examining the lock with her light. "Starting now," she said. The lock was the same hardware as the others, high grade, recently installed, but not beyond what she carried. 3 minutes of work. The door swung open. The cell was exactly as bad as she'd expected. Worse, maybe. She'd had a week to imagine it, and reality had still managed to exceed the estimate. The light bulb, the chain cuffs, the smell of the drain, and Ethan Voss in the center of it, gray with cold and exhaustion, looking at her with eyes that were sharper than anyone's had a right to be after 3 weeks in a room like this. He was taller than she'd expected from the files, even chained to a chair, hunched and drawn, and wearing clothes he'd been in for 3 weeks. There was something in his bearing that made the room feel smaller around him rather than making him feel smaller in the room. She read that, filed it, and got to work on the cuffs. "You're not military," he said, watching her hands. "I was. But not now. Officially, I've been dead for 5 years. His eyes moved over her kit, her rifle, the drive visible in the partially open jacket pocket. "Processing. Calculating." "Project Eclipse," he said. "You knew about it before I did. I found the edge of it 5 years ago." She had the first cuff off. She moved to the second. "I couldn't prove the center. I could only see that something was being held up by a framework that shouldn't exist. And the people who put the framework there had me erased instead." "Yes." She got the second wrist free and moved to the ankles. She could feel him carefully, deliberately not moving too fast as the blood flow returned. He knew enough to know that rushing it would compromise his mobility. "Vale," he said. "Is Vale the top?" "No." "How far up?" She got the second ankle free and stood. "High enough that we need to be out of this city with the evidence before anyone in that chain of command knows it's gone," she said. "Can you walk?" He stood slowly, using the chair back for a moment, then released it. "Yes," he said. He took 3 steps toward the door, unsteady but functional, caught himself on the doorframe. "Okay," he said. "Maybe a little slower than walking." "We have time," she said. "A little." She handed him a secondary weapon from her kit, a compact sidearm, already chambered. He took it with the practiced ease of long familiarity and checked the load without looking down. They moved into the corridor. She was 3 steps ahead of him when they both heard it at the same time. Footsteps in the annex above, moving toward the sub-basement stairs. Not the casual rhythm of a guard on rotation. Fast. Purposeful. Someone had noticed something. She looked back at Voss. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing useful to say. She moved them both back against the corridor wall, into the shadow between the second and third cell doors, and brought the golden rifle up. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and then a second set joined them from the other direction. They weren't just compromised, they were being converged on from both ends. The footsteps hit the bottom stair and she counted 2, maybe 3 sets of boots. The acoustics in the concrete corridor were clean enough to separate them if she focused. 2 from the annex stairs to her right. 1, possibly 2, from the maintenance access at the far left end where the corridor dead-ended at a utility door she hadn't fully cleared. She'd assumed that door was sealed. She'd been wrong. That was the thing about assumptions built on 90 minutes of observation. They were better than nothing and worse than enough. Voss was pressed against the wall beside her, left shoulder to concrete, the compact sidearm up and angled toward the maintenance end. He hadn't been given instructions. He'd read the geometry and positioned himself correctly without discussion, which told her something useful about the kind of soldier he actually was beneath 3 weeks of a chain cuff and a drain smell. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, before the approaching sets of boots reached the cell corridor junction. She pulled a flashbang from her kit, her last one, she noted with the particular displeasure of someone doing inventory math under pressure, primed it, and rolled it toward the annex stairs end of the corridor. "Eyes," she said. Voss closed his eyes and turned his face into the wall. The device detonated at the junction. The corridor filled with concussive light and a pressure wave that she felt in her back teeth. And then she was moving, left first, toward the maintenance access, because the annex stairs were the direction whoever had noticed something would have come from, and the maintenance end was the unknown, and unknowns required attention before momentum. The utility door was open. One figure in the doorway, disoriented, hands up reflexively against the after effects of a flashbang that had caught him at bad range. Young. Gear that matched the perimeter rotation she'd observed earlier. Not part of the primary security detail. A perimeter guard who'd come inside, probably to warm up, probably through a door that wasn't supposed to be unlocked. Wrong place. Very wrong time. She had the rifle butt against his jaw before he'd finished blinking. He folded. She caught him under the arms and put him against the wall instead of on the floor. On the floor was definitive. Against the wall could be mistaken for sleeping if someone came through fast. She turned back. Voss was already moving down the corridor toward her, controlled and quiet despite the obvious stiffness in his legs. From the annex stairs direction, she could hear coughing, the flashbang's residue settling into unprepared lungs. 30 seconds before whoever was on those stairs recovered enough to be functional. She went through the utility door, Voss behind her, pulled it closed. The utility space was a mechanical room, pipes, conduit runs, a secondary generator that wasn't currently active, and a ceiling hatch in the far corner that she estimated put them somewhere in the annex building's ground floor. "Up," she said. "I see it." He went first because she needed to cover the door, and because he was taller and would need less assistance clearing the hatch lip. She watched the door handle while he climbed, one hand on the rifle, tracking the sound of movement on the other side. The coughing had stopped, which meant someone was giving orders, which meant they had maybe 45 seconds before a coordinated search pattern started. "Clear," Voss said from above. She went up the ladder faster than her knee wanted her to, cleared the hatch, and pulled it closed behind her. They were in a narrow service corridor, HVAC runs and electrical conduit, maybe 5 feet of clearance, the kind of space that showed up in blueprints as interstitial and got ignored by people who didn't read blueprints carefully. She'd read the blueprints. 50 meters east, she said, keeping her voice below the level of the pipe hum. "There's a service exit that opens to the gap between the annex and the exterior fence." "You're sure?" "I'm sure about the blueprint. The last 3 hours have demonstrated some limits on how well blueprints match reality." A pause. "Fair," Voss said. They moved. The service exit was where the blueprint said it was. It was also alarmed, which the blueprint hadn't mentioned because the alarm was a field modification, recent installation, the same commercial product as the keypad on Vale's office. Same installer, probably. Someone with a preference for a particular vendor. She disabled it in 90 seconds by cutting the sensor circuit at the conduit, crude but fast, and fast was the operative priority right now. The exit opened to exactly the gap she'd predicted. A narrow channel between the annex's exterior wall and the inner fence line, poorly lit, not covered by the camera positions she'd mapped. The cold hit them when the door opened, genuine December cold, the kind that had weight to it, and she heard Voss pull a breath through his teeth. 3 weeks in a climate-controlled cell. His thermoregulation was going to be compromised. She unzipped a side pouch on her pack and pulled out a folded thermal layer, compact, civilian, no markings, and held it out. He looked at it, looked at her. "Put it on," she said. "We have 2 kilometers on foot and I can't carry you if your core goes." He took it without further discussion and pulled it on over his existing clothes. She noted the way he moved, deliberate, managing the stiffness, not letting it become more than it was. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be. They moved through the gap toward the eastern district, following the route she'd used for ingress. Voss matched her pace without being told. Not quite her speed, but close enough, compensating with shorter intervals between steps rather than longer strides. An adaptation she recognized as someone who understood their current physical limits and was working inside them rather than against them. They were 4 minutes out from the annex when the alert tone sounded. Not a perimeter alarm, a broadcast alert, the kind that came through the external speakers on the command post's roof. A flat, repeating pulse that meant facility-wide security response. Someone had found the guard in the utility room, or found the open cell, or both. "They know," Voss said. "Yes." "How long until they have vehicles on the exterior perimeter?" 4 minutes, maybe 3. "And the extraction point is 2 kilometers?" "Yes." He didn't say anything else, which she appreciated. He lengthened his stride instead. They made it to the edge of the Eastern Industrial District before the first vehicle swept its lights across the outer fence line. She pulled them both down behind a section of collapsed exterior wall, concrete rubble, and rebar, good cover, bad on the knees, and watched the vehicle's pattern. It was moving fast, which was good. Fast meant anxious, and anxious meant the sweep angles were wide and imprecise. A careful search pattern used slow, overlapping arcs. This was a panicked search pattern, which meant Vale's people hadn't had time to organize properly. "They're not coordinated yet," she said. "They will be." "Yes. We have about 8 minutes before the pattern tightens." She pulled her phone, a hardened unit, no SIM, operating on an encrypted local frequency, and sent a single character to the extraction contact she'd established the previous week. X. 30 seconds later, a single character came back. K. The extraction vehicle would be moving to the secondary staging point. Closer, riskier, but manageable, given the compressed timeline. She looked at Voss in the low light. He was breathing harder than he'd been 10 minutes ago, the exertion finally reaching the debt his body had been running for 3 weeks. But his eyes were still clear. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Later. It's relevant to now." She looked at the vehicle, still sweeping, waited. "The person above Vale," he said. "Do you know who it is?" She was quiet for a moment. "I have a candidate," she said. "I haven't confirmed." "Cross," he said. She looked at him. "General Adrian Cross," Voss said. The words came out flat, without the weight that names like that usually carried when people said them. The weight of rank, of authority, of the particular gravity of a decorated superior. He said it the way you said the name of a thing after you'd been thinking about it for a long time and had stopped being surprised by it. "He was the one who approved my posting to the Northern Corridor. He's the only person at the relevant level who had full visibility on both the rescue route timing and the Eclipse procurement channel." She sat with that for a moment. "You worked that out in a cell," she said. "I had time to think." "You didn't have the financial records." "I had pattern recognition." He shifted his position slightly behind the rubble, adjusting to keep weight off his left side. "When you've served under someone for 8 years, you learn the shape of their decisions. Cross always worked through layers, never direct. Always someone between him and the visible action." He paused. "Vale is a layer." "He is. And whatever Cross is building, Eclipse is the funding mechanism. And the war is the cover story," Voss said. "Yes. A conflict that requires resources, that generates procurement, that creates the conditions for money to move in ways that are hard to audit during active operations." He stopped. "How much did you get off the server?" "Enough to establish the framework, financial transfers, communication logs, the personnel record for someone called Harlan, who appears to be the primary administrative layer for Eclipse." She paused. "And Vale's journal." A short silence. "Vale keeps a journal," Voss said. "Handwritten, dense. He documents everything." Another silence, different in texture. "Then we might actually have it," Voss said. It wasn't triumph in his voice. It was something more careful than that, the tone of someone who has wanted something for long enough that wanting it has become its own kind of pain, and he wasn't ready to believe yet that it was actually within reach. The vehicle's sweep pattern shifted, moving east. "We move now," she said. They crossed the remaining distance in segments, cover to cover, using the rubble field and the remains of what had been a manufacturing district before the campaign's early phase had worked through it. She didn't run. Running drew thermal signatures, created noise, and Voss's legs weren't going to sustain it. They moved at a controlled pace that was faster than walking and slower than jogging, the kind of pace that ate distance without announcing itself. And she tracked the vehicle positions by sound and the occasional sweep of light against the building faces above them. At the 1 kilometer mark, she heard something that made her slow. Radio traffic. Not the broad-spectrum alert tone, actual voice traffic, close range, coming from somewhere to the north of their current position. She stopped them behind the burned-out shell of what had been a medium transport vehicle, rust and char, and listened. The voice was giving coordinates. Her coordinates? Not precise, but close. They'd been tracked further than she'd thought. "They have someone ahead of us," she said quietly. Voss listened, his head tilted slightly, the unconscious angle of someone trying to use their hearing. "One voice," he said. "One voice on this frequency. There may be others. Position? North, maybe 200 meters, probably elevated. The signal's clean, which means height." She thought about the building faces she'd been navigating by. The northern line of the manufacturing district included a structure she hadn't fully assessed. A water tower access building, maybe 4 stories, intact enough to be used as an elevated position. Someone had read the same rubble field she had and put an observer on the high ground she'd left unchecked. Not Vale's standard security team. This was someone who thought like she thought. She filed that away with the sensor placement she'd noted during the afternoon observation phase. The same sensibility. Someone who'd anticipated the unconventional approach because they understood how an unconventional operator would think. "We need to go around," she said. "How far does that add?" 400 meters? Maybe 5 minutes. Can we afford 5 minutes? She checked her watch. 4:07. "We can afford 4, she said. They went south to loop around the elevated position, adding distance they didn't have, and she moved them faster than she wanted to because the math had stopped being comfortable. The cold was working on Voss in ways she could see. The thermal layer helped, but it wasn't a solution, and she could see in the quality of his movement that his body was starting to pull resources toward core temperature maintenance and away from muscular efficiency. He didn't complain. She noted that too. At the southern loop's midpoint, they crossed what had been a service road, now partially collapsed into a drainage channel below. A 3-foot gap over black water, concrete edges crumbling. She went across first, rifle balanced, and turned to give Voss a brace point. He looked at the gap. "I'm fine," he said. "I know. Give me your hand anyway." A pause. He gave her his hand and crossed, and she kept the grip until he had both feet on solid ground. He didn't acknowledge it, and she didn't make anything of it. They kept moving. The extraction vehicle was a panel van, dark gray, civilian plates, staged in the loading bay of a structure that had been a cold storage facility. Her contact, a woman she knew only as Daria, who asked nothing and charged accordingly, and had never once in 3 years of intermittent professional relationship expressed curiosity about what was actually happening, had backed the van to within 6 feet of the bay door and left the engine running. Voss saw the van, and something in his posture changed, not visibly dramatic, just a slight reduction in the tension that had been holding him upright for the past 20 minutes. The structural tension of someone who has been refusing to believe they were going to make it until they could see with their own eyes what making it looked like. Daria was in the driver's seat. She looked at them both through the windshield without expression and held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. She nodded. She opened the van's rear doors and helped Voss in. He would have managed without the assist, but managing would have cost him another 30 seconds, and they were already inside the window she'd identified. She pulled the doors closed and moved to the passenger seat. "Any contact?" she asked. 2 vehicles came through the street 2 blocks north about 6 minutes ago. Daria's English was precise and slightly formal in the way of someone who'd learned it from books before learning it from people. "They did not come this way." "They will." "Then we should leave." Daria pulled out of the loading bay without lights, navigating by familiarity. She'd staged here for exactly this reason, knowing the exit route in the dark. The van moved through the streets of the Eastern District at a speed that was unhurried enough to avoid notice from any perimeter position still looking for rapid movement. From the rear of the van, Voss's voice, "Where are we going?" "Safe house," she said, 40 minutes east, and after the safe house. "We get the evidence transmitted before Vale realizes what's missing." A pause. The broadcast, Voss said. It's still happening. Not if we move fast enough. And if we don't move fast enough? She didn't answer immediately. Outside, the ruins of Blackridge slid past the window. Dark buildings, dead streetlights, the occasional glow of a generator-powered position inside a structure that housed someone she couldn't identify and didn't have time to assess. The city looked the way cities looked when something had been done to them that couldn't be undone, every broken surface a record of a decision made by someone who would describe it differently afterward. Then we make sure that what we're transmitting reaches the right people before they can bury it, she said. The broadcast happens, Voss reads whatever statement they've prepared, and for approximately 12 hours, it looks like they've won. But the server contents reach military intelligence before that window closes, and the journal reaches a journalist I trust who will not sit on it. You have a journalist. I have a journalist. A longer pause. You've been planning this for a while, he said, since I intercepted the routing transmission. 2 weeks. You planned an extraction from a secure facility in a hostile-controlled city in 2 weeks. The facility wasn't as secure as it should have been. He stopped. She heard him adjust his position in the back of the van. That's either a significant professional criticism of Vale's security team or a significant professional understatement from you, and I'm not sure which. Daria, who had not spoken since they'd left the loading bay, made a sound that might have been a very small laugh. Both, probably, the woman in the passenger seat said. The safe house was a farmhouse 38 kilometers east of Blackridge, in a landscape that looked like it had forgotten the war existed. Frozen fields, birch trees, a road that was more suggestion than infrastructure. Daria stopped the van in the barn structure adjacent to the main building and cut the engine. The farmhouse had been maintained by the same network that maintained Daria, the network being a loose association of people she'd assembled over 5 years of operating without institutional support, connected by mutual professional respect and the shared understanding that they would each, at some point, need something from the others. She didn't think of them as allies in any formal sense. She thought of them as people who had chosen, each for their own reasons, to be in the part of the world that wasn't visible. Inside the farmhouse, a wood stove that Daria had apparently prepped before driving to the extraction point, a table with a satellite communication unit, emergency medical supplies, food that was basic but caloric, and 2 sets of dry clothes that were approximately the right size for both of them. Voss sat down in the chair nearest the stove, and she watched him not show what that warmth cost him in the particular way that people who'd been cold for too long sometimes couldn't stop their faces from briefly, helplessly reflecting. She went to work on the satellite unit. The drive, she said. He reached under the thermal layer and produced it from where she'd told him to carry it, against his skin, body warmth keeping the components above the minimum operating temperature. She took it without ceremony. You know how to transmit on this frequency? She asked, gesturing toward the unit. I can figure it out. There's a preset channel for military intelligence reception. 3 options. I need you to monitor for confirmation while I prep the journalist package. She paused. Can you do that? He looked at her steadily. I've been sitting in a cell for 3 weeks, he said. Not a classroom. She handed him the unit manual, which she'd annotated in the margins. The annotations are in English, she said. I can read. She went to the table and began preparing the second transmission, the journalist package, which required more selection and framing than the raw intelligence drop to military channels. The MI transmission was simple, everything, unfiltered, with a cover note identifying the source as a classified operative on an undisclosed operation. They would verify or they wouldn't, but the volume and specificity of the evidence made dismissal difficult. The journalist package required judgment, too much, and it was overwhelming. Too little, and the connective tissue between documents was invisible to someone who hadn't spent 2 weeks inside this particular architecture. She was 20 minutes into the selection process when Voss spoke. Confirmation received on the first channel. She looked up. He was holding the unit with both hands, reading the display. They've acknowledged receipt and logged a priority flag, he said. They're asking for source authentication. Tell them Whisper 7. It's an authentication code that's been inactive for 5 years. If anyone there remembers it, they'll know exactly what they're looking at. He relayed it. A pause. Then, they're asking you to stand by. Another pause. They know the code. They're escalating. She went back to the journalist package. Good. Escalating meant someone with the right clearances had recognized the provenance. It didn't mean anything was safe yet. It meant the information was in the right room, which was the first necessary condition. Voss was quiet for a while. She could hear him breathing, slower now than it had been during the transit, and the occasional soft sound of him shifting his weight toward the stove heat. Then, they want to know the location of the primary detainee. Tell them the detainee is mobile and will make contact through official channels at 0800. He relayed it. They're asking for confirmation that the detainee is General Ethan Voss. Tell them yes. A pause. They want to speak with him directly. She looked up from the table. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something between rueful and amused, the expression of a man who has spent 3 weeks in a cell wondering if anyone was looking for him and has just been told, in the most procedural possible way, that they were. She handed him the microphone. He looked at it for a moment. "I've been in there so long," he said quietly. "I almost forgot what it sounded like. Someone asking." She didn't say anything. He keyed the mic. 8044D. She completed the journalist package and transmitted it on the encrypted channel she'd maintained for exactly this contingency. The recipient was a woman named Reyes, who worked for an international news organization and who had, 18 months ago, received a different package from this same channel and had spent the following 3 months verifying it before publishing, at which point a mid-level government official in a country she also wasn't going to name had resigned in a manner the official statement described as voluntary. Reyes didn't know her name. Reyes didn't know this channel's owner was dead on paper. Reyes knew only that the material she received from this source was accurate, significant, and never accompanied by spin, just documents, with a brief note explaining what you were looking at. This note read, Project Eclipse. Start with the journal. The personnel file for Harlan is the connective tissue between the financial layer and the operational layer. Crosses the ceiling. This goes all the way up. She sent it and closed the transmission window and sat in the silence of the farmhouse for a moment, listening to the stovework and the sound of Voss's voice in the background, low and steady on the MI channel, walking someone through the outlines of what he'd found and how he'd found it and what it connected to. His voice had recovered its register. 3 weeks of compression and disuse had roughened it at the edges, but the fundamental quality was still there. The measured confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, without the overemphasis of someone who needed to be. She'd heard voices like that before. She'd heard a lot of voices. Most of them didn't sound like that. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the frozen field and the dark tree line beyond it. Outside, somewhere between that tree line and Black Ridge, Vale was waking up to a cell block with an open door and a server with a recent access log, and a filing cabinet that had been opened and closed and might or might not show the signs of it, depending on how good his people were at the kind of forensic attention to detail that mattered in a moment like this. He would know the evidence was gone. What he wouldn't know yet was how far it had traveled. She had until that changed to make the situation irreversible. She turned from the window. Voss had concluded the MI call and was setting the unit down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing the residual shake in their hands that they were pretending wasn't there. "They're mobilizing a response team," he said. "ETA to Black Ridge is estimated at 3 to 4 hours. Too late to stop the broadcast." "Yes." He looked at her. "But possibly not too late to complicate it." She thought about that. "Complicate how?" "If the response team can be redirected to approach from the south instead of the north, they'll hit the perimeter at the same time as the broadcast window. Vale will have to split his attention. He'll initiate the confession anyway. He'll try. But a confused perimeter during a live broadcast creates footage problems." Voss's eyes were steady. "The statement only works if it looks controlled. If the background becomes chaotic, the confession reads differently to whoever's watching. It reads like a man being forced to speak." She sat down across from him. "That's what it is," she said. "I know. But right now the plan was to make it look like a voluntary admission." He leaned forward slightly. "Chaos disrupts that optic. We don't need the response team to extract me. I'm already out. We need them to arrive visibly." She thought through the implication. The response team arriving in the visible perimeter at broadcast time would do several things. It would draw Vale's security resources. It would create the visible disruption Voss was describing, and it would give whatever footage emerged a context that made the controlled narrative impossible to sustain. It was not a bad instinct. It was also predicated on the response team doing what Voss said, on the timeline Voss said, which required either extraordinary coordination or a significant amount of faith in institutions that had already demonstrated considerable capacity for failure. She said as much. The specific team lead on this mobilization is a colonel by the name of Hendricks, Voss said. I know her. She does what she says she'll do. You trust her. I trust her professional record, which is the appropriate level of trust for someone I haven't spoken to in 8 months, and who is currently receiving mission-critical direction from a man who has been confirmed alive for approximately 4 hours. She looked at him. That's an honest answer, she said. I'm having an honest kind of night. She considered it for another moment, then pulled the communication unit back toward her and began encoding a redirect request to the MI channel. One more thing, Voss said. She looked up. You said you have a candidate for Cross, not a confirmation. He paused. What does confirmation look like? She was quiet. There's a name in the journal, she said. Vale uses an initial, A, for the person giving him orders. The financial records show transfers from an account registered to a holding company that traces through 3 layers before it dissolves. But the holding company was registered in the same 30-day window that Cross took command of the Northern Oversight Committee. Circumstantial. Yes. But? She looked at him steadily. The journal entry for the day before your convoy was ambushed, she said. Vale writes, confirms the window. The general is coming. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man absorbing something he'd suspected for a long time and had been hoping was wrong. Okay, Voss said. She waited. Okay, he said again, quieter. He looked at the stove. The light from it moved on the planes of his face, the lines of exhaustion, the hollows, the particular set of his jaw that she was beginning to read as the expression he wore when he was processing something difficult and doing it by himself, because that was how he'd learned to do it. He was at my daughter's birthday party 2 years ago. He brought her a... He stopped. It doesn't matter. No, she agreed. He used me as... You were clean, she said. That's why. The operation needed a visible command presence who was genuinely uninvolved with Eclipse, so that when the investigation eventually came, and they knew an investigation would come, there was a real person at the visible layer who had genuinely clean hands. You weren't just a target. You were a designed component. Voss was quiet for a long moment. How long have you known that, he said. Since I read the journal. And you didn't... When would I have told you? Between the cell block and the drainage channel? He thought about that. No, he said. You're right. That was the right call. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to apologize for the timing. I'm asking if you understand what it means for what happens next. She understood exactly what it meant. Cross will know the evidence is moving before the MI response team reaches Blackridge, she said. He'll initiate containment, and the containment order will include us. He can't contain evidence that's already been transmitted. No, but he can contain the witnesses who transmitted it. She paused. Vale is a layer. If Cross activates the people above Vale, the people Vale doesn't know about. Are there people above Vale? She reached into her jacket and pulled out the photograph she'd taken of the final page of the journal, set it on the table between them. Voss looked at it. The photograph showed a single line of Vale's careful script at the bottom of an otherwise full page, underlined twice. A says the secondary is already in position. They are not mine. I don't know who they belong to. Voss looked at the photograph for a long time. A secondary team, he said, inside Blackridge. That Vale didn't place and doesn't control. Yes. That means Cross has independent assets in the city. Yes. Assets that Vale doesn't know about, which means they're not part of the security architecture I've been observing for 3 weeks, which means they're not going to behave like the perimeter team or the guard rotation. Yes. He sat back. Outside, the first suggestion of pre-dawn gray was beginning to show at the edge of the tree line. Not light yet, not quite, just the slow withdrawal of the darkest dark that preceded whatever came next. Merry Christmas, Voss said again, and this time there was nothing underneath it that resembled a joke. She was already moving to the window, rifle in hand, scanning the frozen field. The birch trees at the edge of the property stood still against the gray sky. Then one of them moved. The birch tree moved again, and this time she was certain because birch trees in frozen December air at 0450 hours did not move without wind, and there was no wind. She stepped back from the window in a single motion, away from the glass, into the shadow of the interior wall. "We have contact," she said, quietly. The way you said it when quiet still mattered. Voss was already off the chair. She didn't need to look to know. She heard the shift of his weight and the absence of the sounds that would have indicated he wasn't moving. He went left, toward the interior wall, away from the window line. The sidearm was in his hand. "How many?" he said. "One confirmed. Perimeter unknown." "Darya." "Barn." She was already moving toward the rear of the house, keeping below the window levels. "She'll have heard." The farmhouse had 3 exit points, the front door facing the field, the rear door opening toward the barn structure, and a cellar hatch under the kitchen table that she'd cleared and pre-assessed during the staging phase 2 days ago. The cellar hatch opened to a drainage tunnel that ran 40 meters east before surfacing in the frozen ground at the edge of the birch tree line. The birch tree line where the secondary team was currently positioning. She revised the value of the cellar hatch downward. "Rear door," she said. "Stay behind me." "I've been staying behind you for 2 hours." "You've been keeping up with me for 2 hours. It's different." She heard something in the silence that followed that wasn't quite a response, but wasn't nothing either. She moved through this kitchen, keeping to the wall, and got to the rear door. Pressed her hand flat against it and felt the temperature differential. Cold bleeding through the wood, the outside world announcing itself. She went through the edge of the door frame in a low position, rifle up, and cleared right, then left. Clear. She waved Voss through. The barn was 12 meters from the rear door, across ground that was exposed for about 6 of those meters before a rusted equipment shed provided cover. She assessed the angle from the birch tree line to the barn approach and didn't like it. Elevated position in the trees would have a partial sight line to the open section. Partial. Not complete. "Move when I move," she said. "Don't stop." They crossed the 6 meters of exposure in a run that was less elegant than she wanted it to be. Voss's legs were still negotiating the transition back from 3 weeks of immobility, and she shortened her own stride to prevent him from being exposed alone in the open section. They hit the equipment shed wall together, and she pressed them both against it. No shot. Either the elevated position didn't have the angle she'd feared, or it had the angle and was holding. Holding was worse. Holding meant coordination. Holding meant they were waiting for something, a signal, a position, a specific moment. The secondary team wasn't trying to stop them from leaving the house. They were trying to achieve a specific condition before they moved. She thought about what condition that would be. The satellite unit was still on the table inside the farmhouse. She thought about the transmissions she'd sent. The MI channel, the journalist package. Both gone, both received. She had the confirmation codes. The evidence was already moving. But the transmission logs on that unit identified the channel frequencies, the recipient codes, the timing. A technical team could use those logs to compromise the receiving ends, to identify the military intelligence officer who'd flagged the Whisper 7 authentication, to find Reyes. The secondary team wasn't here to kill them. They were here to get the unit. "Stay here," she said. "What?" She was already moving, back across the 6 meters of exposure, back through the rear door, into the kitchen. The satellite unit sat on the table where she'd left it. She had 4 seconds of decision. Take it and give the secondary team nothing but confirm she'd understood their objective, which might prompt a response she hadn't planned for. Destroy it and eliminate the risk entirely. She opened the unit's back panel, found the transmission module, and removed it in a motion she'd practiced enough times that her hands didn't require her full attention. Without the module, the unit was a box with no capability and no logs. She pocketed the module and went back out. The 6 meters of exposure again. She cleared the equipment shed wall and nearly walked into Voss, who had moved to the shed's corner and was covering the open ground with the sidearm. "I told you to stay," she said. "You were gone for 40 seconds, and I heard someone moving in the trees." "How close?" 70 meters, maybe. Moving south along the tree line. South. Toward the barn's far side, away from the direct approach. Flanking. Which meant the team was larger than one elevated position and one flanker. You didn't send a flanking element until you had enough people to maintain your primary coverage. At minimum, 3, possibly 5. She assessed what she had. 1 rifle, 1 sidearm, 1 general who'd been in a cell for 3 weeks, a frozen field, and the pre-dawn dark that was graying at the edges but not yet useful as cover or as light. What she didn't have was a clean extraction route that didn't run through either the birch tree line or the open field approach. "The barn," she said. "There's a vehicle." Daria's vehicle. Yes. They'll be covering the barn's vehicle exit. Probably, she thought. But probably isn't the same as certainly, and the vehicle exit faces east, which puts the barn structure between us and the elevated position in the trees. If the secondary team's primary angle is from the west, we're not covered from the south, Voss said. The flanker. No. So we need the flanker to be somewhere else when we go through the barn. She looked at him. You have something, he said. It wasn't quite a question. She thought about the transmission module in her pocket, about the specific nature of the secondary team's objective, about the fact that they were holding, waiting for a condition. I'm going to give them what they want, she said, or what they think they want. Inside the barn, Daria was in the gap between the van's front bumper and the barn wall, back against the concrete, a compact shotgun across her knees that she hadn't been visibly carrying when she'd picked them up from Blackridge. She looked at them without surprise, which was why this woman had remained useful for 3 years. 3 of them, Daria said. I counted 3 distinct movement signatures. There may be more. The eastern exit, she said. How much clearance once the door opens? Daria considered. 20 meters to the road. The road bends northeast after that, which puts the barn between us and the approach from the field. Any coverage on the road beyond the bend? I don't know. She accepted that. 20 meters of certain exposure and unknown coverage beyond. She pulled the transmission module from her pocket and held it up so both of them could see it. This is what they're here for, she said, or they believe it is. I'm going to make sure they see me carrying it back toward the house. Voss looked at her steadily. You're going to draw them. I'm going to move them. There's a difference. When the primary team repositions toward the house rear approach, the eastern coverage degrades. She paused. That's the window. And you, Voss said. I'll come around the barn's north side while they're repositioning. It's approximately 30 seconds. Approximately. Yes. Voss was quiet for a moment. If the flanker doesn't reposition, he said, if they hold position while the primary moves, then I have the rifle. 1 shot from a moving position, in pre-dawn light, against someone who's watching for you. Yes. He looked at her. She looked back. Okay, he said. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was the sound of a man who has run the alternatives and found them all worse. She handed Daria the transmission module. Get to the vehicle when you hear the shot, she said. Not before. If you don't hear a shot within 90 seconds of the rear door opening, get out anyway. Daria took the module without expression. And if you don't make it to the vehicle, Daria said, drive east, take the secondary road south of the main route, and get him to the coordinates I gave you last week. Daria nodded once. Voss was looking at her again with the expression she was beginning to identify as his version of wanting to say something and not saying it. 90 seconds, she said, and went back to the barn's side door. She came out of the barn on the north side, into the open ground between the barn and the frozen field edge, moving fast but not running, covering ground in the long, low stride that she'd learned produced the least visual signature from an elevated position. The module was in her right hand, visible, the rifle on her shoulder to free the hand, an operator's version of bait. She made herself move toward the house. 40 meters, 30. She counted the seconds. Listened for the specific quality of movement that preceded a team repositioning. Not footsteps, something subtler, the change in the ambient sound profile of people who had been stationary becoming people who were moving. There, south of the trees. A shift, the flanker moving. She stopped moving toward the house and went flat, rifle up, and swung the optic toward the southern tree line in a single practiced motion. The figure in her scope was moving northeast toward the barn's rear, which was exactly the repositioning she'd predicted because the module was the objective and the module appeared to be going back into the house, and the secondary team's clock was the same clock everyone else was running against. Joe 600, the broadcast window. the point at which the evidence they were carrying either mattered or didn't. The flanker was moving northeast, which meant the southern coverage was open. She was back on her feet and running, south toward the barn's far corner, before the flanker had finished the first leg of the repositioning. She cleared the barn's south corner at a sprint, hit the side door at full speed, and was inside and at the van's passenger door before Daria had fully processed her return. "Go," she said. Daria went. The barn's eastern door rolled up with a sound that was simultaneously too loud and completely irrelevant, and the van came out into the 20 meters of open ground at a speed that Daria managed with the particular controlled aggression of someone who'd done this before. The road bend hit them at 15 seconds. The barn structure swung between them and the tree line like a wall closing. No shot. She let herself breathe. In the rear of the van, Voss said, "One shot." Flanker reposition. The south was open. "You didn't need the shot." "No. But you were ready to take it." "I was ready to take it." A pause. "From a moving position," he said, "in pre-dawn light." "I've taken worse," she said. He didn't ask what worse meant. She was grateful for that. The road east was empty at 05:33 in the morning on Christmas Day, which was the one advantage that Christmas provided, the specific temporal gravity of the holiday. Pulling people into houses and away from roads, giving the roads a quality of desertion that Daria used without acknowledgement. They had 47 minutes to the broadcast window. She used 15 of them to reach the secondary objective she'd staged 3 days ago, which was a second communication point, a relay unit installed in the attic of a structure that had been a rural veterinary clinic, now disused, 40 kilometers from Black Ridge and 20 from the farmhouse. The relay unit was hardwired to an external antenna and could reach the military intelligence frequency with a signal quality that the satellite unit, good as it was, couldn't match from a moving vehicle. She'd staged it because she'd expected the farmhouse to be compromised. She'd expected it later than this, but the principle held. Voss followed her up the attic ladder without comment. The relay unit was exactly where she'd left it, covered in a tarpaulin, undisturbed. She had it running in 4 minutes. "MI channel," she said. "Hendricks, the response team lead. Can you reach her directly?" "I have her direct frequency from the earlier transmission." She handed him the relay mic. He raised Colonel Hendricks in 30 seconds. She heard the voice on the other end, clipped, professional, the particular vocal quality of someone who'd been awake since before the mobilization order and wasn't going to mention it. "General Voss, we have your position flagged. Current ETA to Black Ridge perimeter is 2 hours 10 minutes. "That's too late for the broadcast," Voss said. A pause on the other end. "Sir, we're moving at maximum. I'm not asking you to arrive before the broadcast. I'm asking if you can arrive at the south perimeter at 0600 exactly, not before. At 0600. A longer pause. "That's achievable. It's actually closer to our current projection than an accelerated arrival would be. I need your vehicles visible. I need the perimeter to see you coming." "Understood." "One more thing." Voss looked at the relay unit for a moment, then at the wall, the way he'd looked at the stove when he was processing something he didn't want to process. "There's a secondary team operating in the Black Ridge perimeter, not Vales. Independent assets with a separate command chain. You may encounter resistance that doesn't behave like the primary security force. Can you describe them?" "No, that's the problem." He paused. "Treat the entire perimeter as hostile until you've positively identified everyone present." "Copy that, sir." He handed the mic back. She updated Hendricks's team on the last confirmed secondary team positions from the farmhouse and signed off. 5:27. 33 minutes. She stood in the attic of the disused clinic and looked at the relay unit and thought about the architecture of what was about to happen. The broadcast. Vale's prepared statement, Voss's absence from the cell, which Vale had now known about for 3 hours minimum. The evidence transmissions, confirmed received but not yet acted on publicly. Hendricks's team arriving at the south perimeter at 0600. And Cross, somewhere above all of it, receiving information and making decisions she couldn't see or predict. "He'll change the plan," she said aloud. Voss looked at her. "Cross. He knows the evidence moved. He doesn't know how much or where it went, but he knows the server was accessed and the filing cabinet was opened. He's been running this long enough to know what that means." She turned away from the relay unit. "He won't cancel the broadcast. Canceling the broadcast concedes the operation. He'll modify it." To what? The confession was supposed to be controlled. Voss reads a prepared statement, Vale's people record it, it goes out worldwide, and the confession establishes the narrative before the evidence reaches the right hands. She sat down on a wooden crate, thinking through it. Without you in the cell, he can't do that. But he can do something else. Voss waited. He can fabricate it, she said. The statement was pre-written. He has video of you from the cell. They've been recording interrogation sessions. I saw the equipment. She looked at him. With the right editing and the right audio, he doesn't need you present to broadcast a confession. The silence that followed was the silence of a man recalibrating everything he'd thought the next hour looked like. How long would that take? He said. He's had 3 weeks to prepare. If the fabrication was built as a contingency. It was, Voss said. His voice was flat. Of course it was. Cross doesn't run operations without contingencies. She thought about the journal, the careful documentation, Vale's notation about the secondary team. They are not mine. I don't know who they belong to. An independent layer that Vale himself didn't control, positioned inside the operational environment, responsive to a command chain that bypassed the visible architecture entirely. That layer wasn't just security. That layer was the contingency. She stood up. We need to get back to Blackridge, she said. Voss looked at her. You just extracted us from Blackridge, he said. I know. We spent 2 hours getting out. I know. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. What's in Blackridge that we need? The broadcast equipment, she said. If the fabricated confession goes out before Hendrix's team establishes perimeter control, Cross manages the narrative window long enough to compromise the evidence we transmitted. The financial records need context. The journal needs context. Without a public counter-narrative running simultaneously, the confession is the story for 12 hours, Voss said, and 12 hours is enough. Yes. So we need to stop the broadcast. Or redirect it. He looked at her. What does redirect mean? He said. She pulled the transmission module from her pocket, the one she'd taken from the satellite unit at the farmhouse, held it up. The broadcast runs through their satellite uplink, she said. That uplink pulls from the same infrastructure family as the relay I compromised 2 weeks ago. Same vendor, same architecture, which means the authentication protocols are related. You can intercept the broadcast channel. I can insert into it, if I'm within range of their uplink antenna and I have the module. The module has the authentication seed from my earlier access. If the vendor hasn't rotated the keys, which they typically don't on field-deployed units because field rotations require manual updates that field operators almost never prioritize, you can push your own signal through their broadcast. I can push the evidence through their broadcast channel. She let that settle. Every network feed they're connected to, every streaming aggregator pulling from the international press pool. Instead of the fabricated confession, they get the journal, the financial records, the communication logs. Voss was very still. To every network, he said. To every network. Simultaneously. If the timing works. If I'm close enough to the antenna. If they haven't rotated the keys. 3 conditional statements, any one of which could fail. He nodded slowly. What do you need from me? He said. Whoops. Daria did not comment on the return direction. She turned the van around without being asked for an explanation and drove west, back toward Blackridge, in the same controlled manner she applied to everything. In the passenger seat, she prepped the module and the secondary device she'd built 3 weeks ago and had been carrying since a transmission injector, essentially, a piece of hardware designed for exactly this kind of infrastructure insertion, built around the assumption that she'd eventually need to do something with access to a commercial satellite uplink that wasn't fully authorized. The irony being that the access was now fully authorized, in the sense that the people who owned the uplink were going to be arrested by a military response team in approximately 25 minutes. She thought about that. The technical legality of what she was doing, the jurisdiction questions, the chain of custody considerations for the evidence she'd transmitted, for the journal photographs, for the physical files she'd left in Vale's cabinet, on the assumption that leaving them meant Hendrix's team would have certified forensic evidence in situ rather than copies transmitted by a dead woman. She thought about all of that and filed it as a problem for people with more time than she currently had. 5:51. 9 minutes. Tell me about the antenna position, Voss said from the back of the van. Rooftop of the municipal building, eastern corner. I mapped it during the observation phase. We can't get to the rooftop. We don't need to. The antenna has a ground-level access panel for technical maintenance. It's on the building's north face. She looked at the road ahead, calculating distance. We need to get to within 50 meters of the building's north face. The perimeter will be looking south, at Hendrix's vehicles. A pause. If Hendrix arrives on schedule, Voss said. Yes. And if the perimeter rotation doesn't cover the north? The north faces the rubble district. They've maintained minimal coverage there because the sensor network covers the approaches. I found gaps in the sensor coverage during the observation phase. The same gaps you used to get in? Yes. Voss was quiet for a moment. They'll know to close those gaps, he said, after the escape. They'll have reviewed the penetration route. She'd thought about this. Yes, she said, which is why we're not using the same route. She handed him the site map she'd drawn during the observation phase, updated with a second approach vector she'd marked in red grease pencil that morning at the farmhouse before the secondary team arrived. He held it up to the weak pre-dawn light coming through the van's rear window. She heard him study it. Through the maintenance conduit, he said partially. The main conduit, not the drainage tributary. The main conduit is monitored, you said thermal sensors. 40-meter intervals, 90-second sweep cycle. With 2 people moving in sequence, the gap is tight, but workable, if the timing is right. What's the timing window? 11 seconds. Another pause. Per sensor gap. Yes. And there are how many sensors between the conduit entry and the building's north face? 3. So we need to clear 3 11-second windows. In sequence. Yes. She heard him fold the map. And your knee, he said. She didn't answer immediately. I'll manage. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have, she said. The knee will do what I tell it to do until this is finished. She felt, rather than saw, whatever response he chose not to make to that. The particular quality of silence from the back of the van that was someone absorbing a statement and deciding that pushing it further would be both pointless and unkind. Okay, he said. 556. 4 minutes. Daria stopped the van 200 meters north of Black Ridge's outer boundary line in the shadow of a collapsed overpass that provided vehicle concealment from the air and from the southern perimeter. She was out of the van before the engine finished cooling, Voss behind her, moving at the pace his legs currently allowed, which was faster than it had been 2 hours ago. Some recovery. Not full recovery. She adjusted her own pace marginally and didn't mention it. The conduit entry was where she'd identified it, a graded access point in the northeast corner of the rubble district, exactly where the maintenance map said it would be, which was a relief that she kept internal. She got the grate open in 40 seconds. First sensor gap is at 30 meters, she said. I go first. When I clear the first gap, I'll signal. Then you move. What's the signal? She thought about the cell door, the tap sequence. Twice, once, 3 times, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That code is 12 years old, he said, the same words he'd said through the cell door. It still works, she said. Something in his face shifted. Brief. She filed it. She went into the conduit. The water was lower than the drainage tributary, but not absent. 6 inches of near-frozen water at the bottom of a concrete channel wide enough for a body if the body was committed to it. She moved on her elbows and the toes of her boots, rifle balanced on her forearms, counting distance by the sections of conduit visible ahead in the low light from her headlamp. 20 meters. 25. She could feel the first sensor sweep in the passive receiver she carried. A low-frequency pulse, almost below detection, the kind of technical consideration that most infiltration teams never addressed, because most infiltration teams didn't operate in environments where the sensor coverage was this sophisticated. She counted the sweep cycle. 82 seconds. 85. 90. The sweep pulsed. She was at 28 meters when it fired, 2 meters short of the gap. She pressed flat into the conduit floor and waded through the 90-second cycle with her face inches above the water, and thought about her knee, which was communicating with her in terms she was choosing to interpret as advisory rather than mandatory. The sweep pulsed again. She moved. 30 meters. 32. 39. Through. She pressed her knuckles against the conduit wall. Twice. Once. 3 times. 30 seconds later, the conduit behind her registered movement. She tracked his progress by sound and by the faint disturbance in the shallow water, monitoring the sweep cycle, counting. He cleared the first gap with 2 seconds to spare. She heard the adjustment he made at the critical moment, a full-body compression, the instinctive response to the sweep pulse, correct and unhesitating. They moved to the second sensor. The second gap she cleared clean. Voss cleared it with a noise, his right knee hitting the conduit wall at the compression moment. A sound that was controlled immediately but was still a sound, and for 3 seconds afterward she didn't breathe. The sweep cycle completed without variation. Third sensor. 43 meters from the building's north face, which meant they were under the perimeter's inner boundary. She cleared it. He cleared it. And then they were at the access ladder that led up to the maintenance panel on the building's north face, and she could hear, faintly, through the concrete above them, the sound of the broadcast system powering up. 5:59. She went up the ladder. The maintenance panel was on the exterior of the building, accessed from a recessed utility alcove on the north face. She had the panel open in 90 seconds and was looking at the antenna's ground-level distribution node, a rack of hardware that routed the uplink signal and, more importantly, accepted input from authorized technical maintenance units. She slotted the module into the maintenance input port. The injector device connected to the module. She had preloaded the evidence package, journal photographs, financial records, communication logs, the personnel file for Harlan, the transmission intercepts, into the injector's broadcast format during the prep time in the attic. 43 minutes of work that she'd done while Voss was on the relay mic with Hendricks. File conversion, format standardization, metadata tagging that would make the source identifiable to any technical analyst who received it. The injector's authentication process ran. She watched the status indicator. It was taking longer than she'd projected. The key rotation question, she'd assessed it as low probability but not zero, was suddenly the only thing she was looking at. Voss was in the alcove behind her, covering the corner of the building, the sidearm up. 30 seconds, he said. She looked at the indicator. I know. Authentication is, I know. The indicator stopped cycling, a green status light, small and steady. Access granted. From the south, she heard the first sound of Hendricks's vehicles reaching the perimeter. Engine noise, the characteristic low rumble of military transport crossing broken ground. And from above, through the building's exterior wall, the unmistakable audio quality of a broadcast signal going live. She initiated the injection. The evidence package began pushing through the uplink. In the command post on the 3rd floor of the municipal building, Sergeant Talia Wren was watching 3 monitors simultaneously when the broadcast signal did something it was not supposed to do. The main feed, Vale's prepared visual, the fabricated confession sequence they'd spent the previous 2 hours finalizing after the general's cell was found empty, was active on the primary channel. Confirmation receipts were coming in from network aggregators. The signal was going out, and then it wasn't going out alone. "Commander," Wren said. Her voice didn't rise. She'd learned that rising voices in a command post created secondary problems. "We have an intrusion on the uplink." Vale crossed to her position in 4 steps, looked at the monitor. The uplink was carrying 2 signals simultaneously, theirs and something else, something that was pushing into the broadcast feed on the maintenance authentication pathway, which required either physical access to the distribution node or, "Shut it down," Vale said. "If I shut down the uplink, we lose the broadcast window." I said, "Shut it. The evidence is already in the signal, Commander. It's been transmitting for 40 seconds. Every aggregator that's pulling our feed is also pulling the injected package." Wren looked at him. "Shutting down now doesn't stop what's already been received." Vale stared at the monitor. On the secondary display, the injected content was resolving into readable form. Document images, communication logs, financial transfer records. She could see, even at the monitor's resolution, the distinct handwriting of Vale's journal. A specific page, with a specific underlined sentence. Vale read it, his own handwriting, his own words. Going out to every network feed, every streaming aggregator, every international press relay that was pulling from the Blackridge uplink. He read it a second time, then he said very quietly, "Get Cross on the line." Wren picked up the secure handset. From outside, the sound of military vehicles reached the building. "What's it?" In the maintenance alcove on the north face, She watched the injector's progress indicator reach 100% and pulled the module from the port in a clean motion. She looked at Voss. He was watching the south corner of the building, where the sound of Hendrix's vehicles was now accompanied by the first radio traffic of a perimeter engagement. Controlled, professional, the sound of a military response team doing exactly what it had been organized to do. "It's done," she said. He turned and looked at her. The pale gray of Christmas morning was full now. Not sunrise yet, but the kind of light that preceded it, the light that revealed everything without committing to any particular color. In that light, Ethan Voss looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been through something that had no good name and who was still standing on the other side of it. He looked at the module in her hand, at the rifle on her shoulder, at her face, which she was aware had not changed expression in a way she could identify. "Did you ever think," he said, "when you found that routing transmission 2 weeks ago, did you actually think this would work?" She thought about the honest answer. "I thought it had a better chance than anything else I could see," she said. "That's not the same as thinking it would work." "No." He nodded slowly. From the south, the radio traffic sharpened. The sound of a perimeter being taken under control, orders being given by a voice she recognized as Hendrix, acknowledgement codes coming back from positions around the building. And then, from inside the building, a sound she hadn't expected. Shouting. Not combat, not the flat, pressured communication of people in a firefight. Something else. The kind of shouting that happened when a chain of command fractured along a line that had been under tension for a long time. She looked at Voss. He was listening to it too, his head at that slight angle. "Vale's people," he said. She listened harder. The shouting resolved into fragments she could parse. 2 voices, maybe 3, and the specific register of men who had just seen something that changed their calculation of which direction was safety. They'd seen the broadcast, or they'd seen Hendrix's vehicles, or both. And somewhere in Vale's command post, the architecture of the operation was coming apart at the seams that Cross had stitched together 18 months ago and that had held, right up until the moment a dead woman crawled through a drainage conduit with a golden rifle and decided it had held long enough. She closed the maintenance panel. "We need to be visible," she said. "Hendrix needs to see you before her team secures the perimeter, or this gets complicated." Agreed. Around the north corner and to the main approach, slowly, hands clear of weapons. He looked at the sidearm in his hand, safed it, and holstered it. She slung the golden rifle, muzzle down, butt up, the unmistakable configuration of a weapon being carried rather than employed, a specific signal, if you knew how to read it. They came around the north corner of the municipal building into the growing gray light of Christmas morning, and below them Hendrix's vehicles were arrayed across the southern approach with their headlights cutting through the cold air, and a figure in Colonel's insignia was standing outside the lead vehicle looking toward the building with field glasses. The glasses lowered. A long moment. Then Colonel Hendrix's voice, carrying across the frozen plaza with the particular quality of someone who'd been doing this for a long time and had stopped needing amplification. "General Voss, you look terrible, sir." Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite something else. "Yes," he said, "I do." And in the command post above them, through the walls, she heard a different voice. Clipped, precise. The voice of a man who had just received news that changed everything, say a single sentence into a secure handset before the line went dead. She would not hear that sentence until later. When she did, she would understand that the war was not yet over. But standing in the gray light of Christmas morning, with the evidence moving through every broadcast channel on the continent, and Hendrix's team securing the perimeter and the golden rifle slung at her back, she let herself have one breath that was not about the next problem. Just one. Then she started thinking about Cross. The sentence she hadn't been able to hear through the wall came to her 6 hours later, from Hendrix, who'd gotten it from the communications officer who'd been monitoring Vale's secure handset traffic at the moment the line went dead. Burn the record and find the woman. Not Vale. Cross. Cross had been on the line when the broadcast signal fractured, when the evidence package pushed through the uplink and into every network feed simultaneously. He'd heard it happening in real time, the aggregator confirmation codes dropping off the primary channel as the injected content displaced the fabricated confession. The 4 seconds of dead air that followed before the network operators began reacting. The cascade of editorial decisions that meant the journal photographs and the financial transfer records were being reviewed by producers on 3 continents before Yo 620 on Christmas morning. He'd said 7 words and cut the line. Burn the record and find the woman. She was in a forward operating base 30 kilometers east of Blackridge when Hendricks told her this. A converted agricultural facility, temporary, functional, in the specific utilitarian way of military spaces that aren't supposed to exist long enough to become comfortable. She was sitting on a folding chair with a mug of something that had been described as coffee and technically contained caffeine, and she was on her 3rd hour of what the intelligence officers kept calling a debrief, and what was actually a structured interrogation that everyone present was pretending wasn't that. She'd been in rooms like this before. Different rooms, different people across the table, same fundamental architecture of careful questions and careful pauses, and the particular attention of people who needed to know more than they were being told. She answered what she answered and declined what she declined and kept her face neutral throughout, which she could tell was making the lead debrief officer, a major named Carver, competent, persistent, clearly operating under instructions that originated somewhere above his own authority, increasingly frustrated in a way he was managing professionally. The transmission module, Carver said. The injector device. These are not military-issue materials. No. Where did you acquire them? Through channels that are no longer relevant. We'd like to determine whether... Major. She looked at him. The evidence is transmitted. The broadcast was disrupted. The journal and financial records are currently being reviewed by 4 international news organizations, 2 of which have legal teams who will have them published within 24 hours, regardless of any military information control order you can generate at your level. She paused. What exactly is the problem you're trying to solve right now? Carver looked at her, looked at the folder in front of him. You are officially listed as deceased, he said. Catherine Lane, Captain, Special Operations Command, killed in action during Operation Greyfield, classified, 5 years ago. She didn't say anything. Which means you've been operating without authorization, without oversight, and without legal sanction for 5 years. I've been operating without institutional support, she said. Those aren't the same thing. In terms of military law, I'm not currently subject to military law. Catherine Lane is dead. She held his gaze. You're talking to someone who doesn't exist. A pause. That's a complicated position to take, Carver said, for someone sitting in a military facility drinking military coffee. She looked at the mug. It was, she had to admit, a fair point. Voss was in the medical annex when she was finally released from the debrief room. Not because Carver was satisfied. He wasn't, and she understood he'd have more questions at a later time from people with higher authority than his, but because someone above Carver had decided the session was done, and Carver had received that communication mid-question and closed his folder and left without explanation. She'd sat in the empty room for a moment after he left, listening to the bass sounds, generators, vehicle movement, voices in corridors, and had thought about what burn the record meant in operational terms. The record was the evidence trail that led from Project Eclipse's financial architecture back to Cross. The digital components, server contents, transmission logs, were already distributed beyond any practical containment. But the physical components were another matter. Vale's journal was still in the filing cabinet in the command post, unless Hendricks's team had recovered it. The personnel file for Harlan was physical. The early layer financial documents that Cross had signed personally, which she'd seen in the cabinet and photographed but whose physical presence was still in that building. Cross couldn't burn what was already transmitted. But he could make the physical chain of custody unreliable, and in a legal proceeding, which was what this was now moving toward, chain of custody was not a technicality. It was architecture. She found Voss in the medical annex sitting on an examination table while a medic worked on his wrists. The cuff wounds were worse than they'd looked in the dim light of the cell and the pre-dawn dark. The medic, a young woman who was maintaining professional focus with visible effort, had already applied a topical treatment and was bandaging with the careful attention of someone who understood that the patient in front of her was going to be asked about those injuries in a formal setting, and the documentation mattered. Voss was watching her work with the patience of someone who'd learned to be still. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he said. "Structured." She sat down on the chair beside the examination table. They're trying to establish what I am before they decide what to do with me. What are you? Right now? Unclear. The medic glanced up briefly, then went back to the bandaging. Cross made a call, Voss said. It wasn't a question. 7 words. Carver told me. She relayed them. Voss was quiet for a moment. He's going to try to collapse the physical evidence, he said. Yes. The journal is still in the building. Unless Hendrix's team pulled it. Did they? She looked at him. I don't know, she said, and I haven't been able to ask because I've been in a room with Carver for 3 hours. Voss looked at the medic. Are you almost done? 2 more minutes, sir. He looked at the door. I need to talk to Hendrix, he said. You need to rest. I need to talk to Hendrix. She looked at him. The wrists, the pallor, the controlled steadiness that she'd come to recognize as his version of operating past his actual capacity. He'd been doing it since the cell. He would keep doing it because that was the kind of person he was, and telling him to stop would be like telling the building to stop being cold. I'll find her, she said. Hendrix was in the operations room, which was the largest space in the converted facility, a former equipment storage area, now dense with field comms units and the particular organized chaos of a military operation in its consolidation phase. She was standing at a map table with 2 junior officers when the woman with the golden rifle walked in, and she looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this and had decided not to pretend otherwise. The journal, she said before the question was asked. Tell me you have it. We have it. Hendrix straightened. Physical files, the journal, the server. The server's hardware was pulled from the command post before the secondary team could implement the destruction order. One of Vale's own people stopped them. She processed that. Which of Vale's people? Sergeant Wren, the comms officer. When the secondary team moved to implement the destruction protocol, she physically blocked access to the server rack and refused to move. Hendrix paused. She took a hit for it. She's in the medical annex. She'll be fine. She thought about Wren, the young woman at the console who'd noticed the active terminal during the server copy and had looked at it, looked away, taken a drink from her coffee mug. She hadn't been sure at the time whether Wren had seen something or hadn't. Now she thought Wren had seen something and had made a decision in the moment about what to do with it. Had made the same decision again, hours later, in a more costly way. Where's Vale? She said. Custody. He came out of the command post with his hands up when we took the perimeter. Didn't resist. Hendrix said it with the flat quality of someone reporting a fact they found surprising and hadn't finished processing. He's been cooperative since. Surprisingly cooperative. He saw the journal content in his broadcast. Yes. He understood what it meant. Yes. She thought about Vale, about a man who'd spent his career being the implementation layer for people whose names he only knew by initial, who documented everything in a handwritten journal that he'd apparently never intended to destroy, had never implemented the destruction protocol himself, even when the operation started to fracture. A man who kept records of the things he'd done in careful, dense script in a notebook he bought at a stationery shop. People who kept records like that were not people who'd fully committed to the version of events their employers needed them to commit to. He'll cooperate with the investigation, she said. We think so too. Hendrix looked at her with the direct attention of someone who'd spent the last 6 hours revising their assumptions about the situation they were in. I need to ask you something. Ask. The authentication code. Whisper 7. I ran it after the call set, pulled the classification file. She paused. It's tied to an operation from 5 years ago, Grayfield. And the operator who authenticated under that code was listed as dead. Yes. Hendrix looked at her for a long moment. Catherine Lane, she said. She didn't confirm or deny it. The name felt like something that belonged to another person, not in the way of disowning it, but in the way that a tool that has been repurposed loses the identity of its original function. Catherine Lane had been a captain in Special Operations Command. What she was now didn't have a category. The Grayfield After Action report listed the mission as a failed extraction, Hendrix said. Cause of failure, intelligence compromise. Yes. The intelligence compromise was internal. Yes. And the report's determination that you were KIA was a determination made by the people who compromised the intelligence, she said. It was a convenient conclusion for them. Hendricks absorbed that. You've been operating for 5 years on the knowledge that the people who burned your mission were still inside the institution, she said. Yes. And you didn't surface it. I surfaced it once, the first time I found the edge of what was later formalized as Project Eclipse. She held Hendricks's gaze. What happened after I surfaced it is why Catherine Lane is dead on paper. A silence. Cross, Hendricks said. I couldn't prove it then. I can prove it now. Hendricks looked at the map table for a moment, then back. Where is he? She said, not asking where Cross currently was located, asking where she thought he was going. He's been out of the country for the past 72 hours, she said. I tracked his travel through the same infrastructure I used to intercept the Eclipse communications. He flew to a transit hub 4 days ago, private charter, civilian registration, a route consistent with someone who wanted flexibility rather than speed. He knew the operation was in its final phase, and he was positioning himself to be elsewhere when it concluded. Elsewhere meaning a jurisdiction with limited extradition cooperation and the kind of financial infrastructure that makes asset movement easy. She paused. He has money that isn't in any account connected to his name. The holding company traces I found are the surface layer. Below that, I don't know how deep it goes. If he reaches a country he's pre-positioned in, and we lose the window, she said. The evidence establishes the framework. It doesn't automatically compel extradition from a government that has other priorities. We have maybe 18 hours before he's in a position he's held for longer than we've been aware of the architecture. Hendricks was very still. You know where he's going, she said. I have a candidate destination. Based on the holding company's registration jurisdiction, the charter flight's last confirmed waypoint, and an asset I identified in the financial records, a property registered through 4 layers of corporate ownership to an individual whose name I recognized from the Grayfield mission files as a contact cross used for non-official communication. Hendricks looked at her for a long time. You have more than a candidate, she said. I have a location. And you're telling me this instead of... Hendricks stopped. Why are you telling me this instead of handling it yourself? She thought about the honest answer. Because handling it myself means one woman with a rifle in a country where I have no support infrastructure and no legal standing against a man who has had 5 years more preparation time than I have. She paused. And because I'm tired. The last part came out more plainly than she'd intended. Not an emotional statement, just a factual one. She was tired in the specific way of someone who had been running on forward motion and the discipline of immediate necessity for a very long time. And the immediate necessity had momentarily resolved, and the forward motion was encountering the question of what it was moving toward. Hendricks looked at her with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite professional respect, and was somewhere in the overlap of both. I need to make some calls, Hendricks said. Yes. High level. I assumed. This is going to generate a significant amount of institutional disruption. I know. People who've been comfortable with the current structure of things are going to be very uncomfortable. That's generally what accountability feels like. Hendricks almost smiled. Not quite. Stay in the facility, she said. Don't disappear on me. I need to be able to find you in the next 4 hours. I'll be with Voss. Hendricks nodded and turned back to her map table, already reaching for the secure handset. She found Voss outside the medical annex, standing in the narrow corridor with his newly bandaged wrists and the expression of a man who'd just finished a call he'd been dreading. Elena, he said, before she asked. She nodded. He leaned against the corridor wall with his head tilted back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. His eyes were dry. Whatever the call had been, he'd processed the part of it that showed before he came back into the corridor. She knew, he said. She'd known for 2 weeks that something was happening. Someone from the response team's support staff they'd been better about keeping her informed than the official channels. She wasn't told where I was, just that there was active movement. That's more than most families get. Yes. He looked at the wall across from him. She said she was going to make pancakes, Christmas pancakes. She said Maya had been insisting on it, and she'd been stalling, and she was done stalling. His voice was even. Almost. She's going to make Christmas pancakes and wait for me to come home. She didn't say anything. I have to testify, he said. Full debrief, formal, probably multiple sessions. I'll be in a facility somewhere for weeks. Yes. I won't be home for Christmas pancakes. No. He looked at her. She knows that too, he said. She said it's okay. She said they'll make them whenever I get there. He stopped. She's a better person than I deserve. Probably, she said. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. That's not the response I know what response you were looking for. I don't do that response. What response is that? The one where I tell you that you do deserve her, and that everything is going to be fine, and your family is going to be okay. She looked at him directly. Your family is going to have to process a significant amount of trauma related to 3 weeks of not knowing. That's real. And it's going to take time, and it's not going to resolve the way Christmas pancakes resolve. But your daughter is going to get her father back, and she's going to have him because someone decided to go into that conduit, and that's also real. He held her gaze. Catherine Lane, he said. She was quiet. Hendricks called me while I was waiting out here, he said. She told me the name, told me the Grayfield file. He paused. I remember Grayfield. I wasn't in the command chain. I was 2 levels outside the compartment, but I remember the after action, the intelligence compromise. The captain listed as KIA. Then you remember as much as most people do. The compromise investigation was closed without a finding, he said. I remember that too. I thought it was sloppy. I didn't push it. You weren't in the compartment. No, but I could have. He straightened from the wall. If I'd pushed on that closed investigation 5 years ago, you couldn't have known what you'd find. Maybe. But I didn't push because it was closed, and closed files mean paperwork, and at the time I had 3 active operations and a procurement review on my desk, and a captain I'd never met was officially dead, and he stopped. I'm trying to tell you something. I know what you're trying to tell me. I'm not sure you do. You're trying to apologize for the institutional failure that led to me spending 5 years as a ghost, she said. And you think that means something because you're a general, and generals have weight. He waited. It means something, she said. It doesn't change anything, but it means something. He nodded slowly. What do you want? He said. After this, when Cross isn't finished. When Cross is finished, what do you want? She thought about the question. It was the kind of question she'd stopped applying to herself a long time ago because forward motion doesn't require a destination. It only requires a direction. But the immediate necessity had resolved, momentarily, and the question was sitting in the space that created. I want the Grayfield file reopened, she said. Full investigation. Everyone involved in the intelligence compromise identified and processed. That's professional. What do you want personally? She looked at him. That is personal, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, accepted it. I'll push for the Grayfield reopening from my testimony, he said. It'll be early, before they want to go there. They'll push back. Push harder. Yes. At 1:400 hours, they brought Vale into a room with Voss. Her request. Hendricks had processed it for 40 minutes before approving it, and the approval had conditions. 2 officers present, session recorded, duration limited. She was allowed to observe through a one-way panel, which suited her. She stood in the observation room and watched Voss sit down across the table from Marcus Vale for the first time in the same room under conditions that were nothing like the conditions Vale had arranged for. Vale looked smaller than she'd imagined from his operational profile. She'd built an image of him from his decisions and his security architecture and his journal and the way his people moved and talked about him. The man in the chair was compact, precise in his posture even now, with the specific containment of someone who'd decided, sometime in the past 6 hours, that the thing to do was stop performing and sit with what was actually true. He looked at Voss across the table. General, he said. Commander, Voss said. A pause. I want to say something before the formal session begins, Vale said. One of the observing officers shifted. Voss raised a hand slightly, and they stilled. Go ahead, Voss said. Vale looked at the table surface, then back at Voss. I want to say that I understood what I was doing, he said. I want to say that clearly because I've been thinking about what it would mean to say I didn't, to say I was deceived or pressured or that I didn't understand the full scope. And I did understand. He paused. Not everything, at first. The early involvement was presented as strategic ambiguity, a conflict management approach that operated outside official channels. That language made it easier to not ask the questions I should have asked. Voss was very still. At what point did you understand what it actually was? He said. Vale was quiet for a moment. When the first rescue team walked into an ambush, he said, I had the route information because it came through my comms infrastructure. I passed it up the chain. He stopped. I passed it up the chain, and then 8 men walked into a prepared position, and I understood what the chain was using the information for. And I passed the next set of routes, too. The silence in the observation room was the silence of a thing being said that had needed to be said for a while. Why? Voss said. Vale looked at him. Because by then I'd done enough that stopping wasn't an option that felt real, he said. That's not an excuse. It's a description of how it works. Every step makes the next step easier to take and harder to walk back from. Voss said nothing. His face was doing nothing visible, which she'd come to understand meant he was doing something significant internally. Cross, Voss said. Yes. Was the journal a record for yourself, or was it for this? Vale looked at the table again. Both, he said. When I started it, it was, I needed somewhere to put things that I couldn't put anywhere else. And then at some point I understood that it had become something else. Insurance, maybe. Or a record that survived me if it came to that. He looked up. When the broadcast signal split and I saw the journal content going out, I knew what that meant. Whoever had done it had been in my office, had photographed every page. He paused. I wasn't sorry. She watched Voss process that. You let the evidence be in a position to be found, Voss said. I didn't actively facilitate it. But you didn't implement destruction protocols on the physical files. You didn't rotate your office keypad. You maintained the journal rather than burning it. Vale held his gaze. No, he said. I didn't. Voss sat back. Okay, he said. Let's start from the beginning. The first contact, the first conversation where Eclipse was named. He looked at the recording equipment. Everything. Vale nodded. He started talking. She left the observation room at 15:20 and went outside for the first time since the pre-dawn conduit transit. The air was cold and sharp in the specific way of late December afternoons, the sun already declining toward the western tree line, the light going golden and horizontal. She stood in the facility's exterior lot and breathed. Her knee was telling her things she'd been ignoring since the conduit. Her hands were steady, which was a professional positive, but there was a fine tremor behind the steadiness that she recognized as the body's accounting process. The deferred reckoning of adrenaline expenditure and cold exposure, and the specific toll of doing what she'd been doing for 24 hours after 2 weeks of preparation that had itself followed 5 years of the particular kind of sustained vigilance that didn't rest and didn't stop and didn't allow the questions that Voss had asked her in the corridor. What do you want? She stood in the afternoon light and let the question exist without answering it. Her phone, the hardened unit, still carrying the connection to the encrypted channel she'd sent the journalist package through, vibrated once. She looked at the screen. A message from Reyes's channel. One line. We're publishing in 6 hours. Is there anything you need corrected before we go? She read it twice. She typed back, no corrections. One addition. Grayfield. The intelligence compromise investigation that closed without a finding 5 years ago. It connects to the same architecture. Include it. A pause. Then, do you have documentation? She thought about the Grayfield file. Classified. Not in any of the packages she'd transmitted. Available to her through channels she'd maintained but hadn't pulled for this operation because she'd prioritized the Eclipse documentation. She typed, I'll have it to you in 4 hours. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the tree line. 4 hours to pull the Grayfield documentation. 6 hours to publication. And somewhere in transit, Adrian Cross moving toward a position he'd prepared years ago against exactly this contingency. Hendricks would be making calls. The machinery would be moving. And the machinery might be enough. Might be if the right people received the right information and acted on it with the right speed, which required an institutional coherence that Project Eclipse had spent 18 months actively undermining. Or it might not be enough. She looked at the golden rifle leaning against the facility's exterior wall beside her. Then she went back inside to pull the Grayfield file. At 8:47 hours, Hendricks found her in the communications room. Cross-landed, Hendricks said. She looked up from the terminal. When? 40 minutes ago. Private airfield. The destination you identified was correct. Hendricks sat down across from her. Her face was doing the thing that faces did when they were carrying news that didn't have a clean shape. We have a formal extradition request in process. It's going to take time. How much time? Weeks. Possibly months. The government in question has a history of extended procedural review on extradition requests from our jurisdiction. Hendricks paused. Particularly for individuals with significant financial relationships in their banking sector. She looked at the terminal screen. He's positioned himself well, she said. Yes. The financial records we transmitted, the holding company traces, will reach the relevant investigative bodies, but the asset freezing process is also going to take time, Hendricks said. She sat with that. He's not safe, Hendricks said. The evidence is too broad, too well distributed. He will eventually be brought back. But eventually is, not now, she said. Not now. She looked at her hands. The tremor that had been behind the steadiness was less present than it had been an hour ago, the body having processed some portion of its accounting. Not all. Not enough that she trusted the next 24 hours of her judgment entirely. Voss, she said, is he still in session with Vale? Session concluded at 1700. Voss is in the medical annex. They want him to stay overnight for monitoring. Hendricks paused. He agreed, which tells me he's less steady than he's presenting. He's been presenting for a long time, she said. Yes. Hendricks looked at her. He asked about you. She didn't respond to that. He asked whether you were going to be here in the morning, Hendricks said. He specifically said in the morning. She understood what the specificity meant. Voss knew what cross-landed and extradition takes time meant for the next decision she'd be looking at. He was asking whether she was going to make that decision tonight. She thought about being tired, about what tired actually meant, functionally, in terms of judgment and execution, and the specific kind of decision-making that produced outcomes you could live with. She sent the Grayfield package to Reyes at 1853, confirmed receipt at 1856, publication in 4 hours and change. Then she went to the medical annex. Voss was in the third room, sitting up, not reclining, because of course he was sitting up, because that was the kind of man he was. Someone had brought him food that was better than FOB's standard, and he'd eaten about half of it, which she took as a positive indicator. He looked at her when she came in. He read her face. Read it with the accuracy of someone who'd been reading her face for less than 24 hours, but had apparently paid close attention. He landed, Voss said. Yes. Extradition timeline. Weeks, months. He nodded slowly. You could be there in 30 hours, he said, if you left tonight. Yes. With documentation that establishes criminal jurisdiction under international frameworks that the destination country has nominally signed. Nominally, she said, but enough for a legal argument. A legal argument takes the same weeks or months. He looked at her. That's not what I was suggesting, he said. I know. I was suggesting that sometimes legal arguments are what you use to fill a room while something else is happening in the same building. She looked at him for a moment. You're a general, she said. You're not supposed to suggest that. I'm suggesting you take the legal documentation and the months-long extradition process very seriously, he said, and that if, in the course of that very serious process, opportunities present themselves. I understand. Good. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. The afternoon light was gone now, the room lit by the flat overhead of a military medical space, and outside the windows the darkness was the particular deep dark of a rural facility far from city light. You were always too honorable, she said. He looked at her, slightly startled. That's what he'll say, she said. Cross. If we ever get him in a room, that'll be his read on you. That your honesty, your refusal to participate in what he was building, was a weakness. That it made you a target. Voss was quiet. He's wrong, she said. I know. It's why you survived. Not despite it. Because of it. She looked at the window. Men like Cross, they don't understand that the thing they call weakness is the only thing that makes what you do worth doing. He built something on the assumption that everyone has a price and everyone bends eventually. He built it well. and it still fell apart because he couldn't account for people who genuinely didn't have a price. Voss looked at her. "Is that you?" he said. "No price?" She thought about it. "I had a price," she said. 5 years ago they paid it. They took the mission and the team and the name and left a dead woman in the record." She paused. "Turns out that was the wrong price to pay, because dead women don't have careers or ranks or reputations to protect. Dead women can do things that living ones with institutional standing can't." "Dead women with golden rifles," Voss said, "among other things." He was quiet for a moment. "Catherine Lane," he said. Not asking, just saying it. "That's who I was," she said. "And now?" She looked at the window again, the dark outside. The invisible distance beyond it, and somewhere in that distance a man who'd said 7 words and cut a line, and was now sitting in a position he'd prepared for with the patience and the resources of someone who'd believed, right up until Christmas morning, that he was untouchable. "Now I'm whoever gets on a plane tonight," she said. Voss looked at her steadily. The medical room's flat light made everything factual. No shadows to soften anything, no ambient darkness to give distance to the weight of what they were both sitting in. "Come back," he said. It was 2 words, plainly said, without the architecture of a request or an order or a sentiment, just a statement of what he wanted. She stood up. "I'll be in touch," she said. She walked to the door, stopped, didn't turn around. "Merry Christmas, General." She heard him exhale, slow, long, the exhale of a man who was going to hold what had just been said in the room after she left it. "Yeah," he said. "Merry Christmas." She walked out into this corridor and toward the facility exit, and behind her the door of the medical room swung gently closed, and ahead of her the dark outside the facility windows was the specific dark that preceded the next thing. She walked toward it. She took a civilian flight under a name that wasn't Catherine Lane and wasn't dead, connecting through 2 transit hubs that added 7 hours to the journey and made the routing nearly impossible to reconstruct without access to 3 separate airline databases under 3 separate jurisdictions. She slept on the second leg. Not well. Well enough. The destination was a coastal city she'd been to once before, years ago, in a different context. A brief layover during an operation she couldn't name that had taken her through an airport she'd spent 40 minutes in before continuing south. She remembered the light, the specific quality of afternoon light off open water, the way it made everything look more permanent than it was. She arrived at 0840 local time, 2 days after Christmas. Cross had been in the country for 60 hours. She didn't go to him immediately. That was the instinct, the forward momentum that had carried her from the drainage tributary through the conduit, through the farmhouse, and back through Black Ridge and out the other side, the instinct that said the next problem is ahead of you and you move toward it. She recognized the instinct and set it aside because the instinct was not always right, and she was tired in ways that she needed to account for before she made irreversible decisions. She found a room in a mid-tier hotel 3 kilometers from the waterfront and slept for 6 hours, and ate a meal that she ordered without strategy and didn't fully taste. She cleaned the knee properly for the first time. The conduit transit had done things to it that her field treatment had managed but not resolved, and sat with the discomfort of that for a while before her body sorted itself into something functional. Then she pulled out the phone and checked the channels. Reyes had published. The story had gone out at 0200 on December 26th, 8 hours after she'd sent the Grayfield edition, and by the time she was reading it in a coastal hotel room, it had been up for 31 hours and had been picked up by every major news organization in 11 countries. The headline was measured. Reyes didn't do sensational, which was why she was trusted, but the content was not. Financial transfer records, communication logs, journal excerpts, the personnel file for Harlan, who turned out to be a mid-level administrator named Reginald Harlan, who had resigned from his position 6 months prior and who was, as of publication, reportedly unavailable for comment. The Grayfield section was in the 4th installment of a rolling series framed around the pattern of intelligence compromise and the closed investigation, without naming Catherine Lane directly, because there was no Catherine Lane alive to name. She read the Grayfield section twice. Seeing it in print, the outline of what had happened 5 years ago, described accurately and attributed to documentation rather than allegation, produced a sensation she didn't have an immediate name for. Not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of a weight being set down that you've been carrying long enough that you forgot it had a specific shape. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she picked it up again and read the message from Hendricks that had come in while she was sleeping. Vale's testimony is comprehensive. Cross's financial accounts in 3 jurisdictions have been flagged for review. 2 of the 3 governments have cooperated with provisional freezing orders. Cross himself. The extradition request is formally submitted. Timeline is what we discussed. One more thing, the Grayfield investigation has been formally reopened. Voss pushed for it in his opening testimony session. The JAG officer handling it is asking for a point of contact for the primary witness. That would be you, if you're willing. She read it 3 times. Then she typed back, "Tell the JAG officer I'll contact them when I'm back in country. Timeline TBD." Hendricks's response came in 40 seconds. "Understood. Be careful." She put the phone in her pocket. She found Cross on the 3rd morning. Not through surveillance infrastructure or technical intercept. Those were tools she'd have needed weeks to establish in a new operational environment. She found him through the property she'd identified in the financial records. The asset registered through 4 corporate layers to Cross's non-official contact, which turned out to be a waterfront house on a peninsula 15 kilometers from the city center. She'd identified the peninsula from the records. The specific house had taken one afternoon of patient observation from a rented boat on the water, watching the lights, watching the movement pattern of a man who thought his position was secure enough to be careless. He walked on the beach every morning at 0700. Alone. The house had security. 2 men, she assessed, professional but not exceptional, positioned with the confidence of people who believed the location was unknown, rather than the vigilance of people who believed the threat was imminent. She watched him walk on the beach for 2 mornings before she did anything else. He was 63 years old. She knew this from his file. In person, on a beach at 0700 in the pale winter light of a coastal December, he looked like what he was. A tall man, fit for his age, moving with the deliberate carelessness of someone who had convinced himself he'd outrun the consequences of his own decisions. He looked like someone's grandfather. She thought about 8 soldiers walking into a prepared ambush on rescue routes that Vale had passed up the chain. She thought about the men and women who had died in a campaign whose strategic rationale had been manufactured for procurement purposes. She thought about Catherine Lane, KIA, classified, filed away in a closed investigation that no one had pushed on. He looked like someone's grandfather. That was how it worked. On the 3rd morning, she was on the beach when he arrived. Not with the rifle was in the hotel room, broken down, in a case that looked like camera equipment. She was on the beach with her hands in the pockets of a civilian jacket, and the cold sea air coming off the water with that particular salt weight that coasts had in December, and she was standing approximately 40 meters from the point where he usually turned around. He saw her when he was 20 meters out and slowed. He was a man who'd spent his career reading threat indicators. He read her. The posture, the position, the fact of her presence in a location he'd assessed as unknown. And she watched the reading process happen in the quality of his movement before he'd consciously processed its conclusion. He stopped. "General Cross," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know you," he said. "No," she said. "You know a report that says I'm dead." A long pause. The sea behind her. The specific sound of water on a pebbled beach, the low continuous percussion of it. His face did something complicated. Not fear, not yet, or not entirely. Something more like the expression of a man confronting a variable he'd been certain he'd eliminated. "Catherine Lane," he said, "you have a good memory." "I have a thorough memory." He looked at her hands. Her pockets. His security detail was at the house. Too far to be useful at this range, even if she'd wanted them. He understood that too. "You're not here to arrest me. I'm not in a position to arrest you." "Then what are you here for?" She took her hands out of her pockets. Empty. She wanted him to see that clearly. "I wanted to look at you," she said. "I've been looking at your decisions for 5 years. I wanted to see the person making them." He looked back at her with the particular wariness of a man trying to calculate the nature of a threat he doesn't fully understand. "And?" he said. "And you look like what you are," she said, "which is less than I expected." Something moved across his face. Brief. She filed it. "The accounts are frozen," he said. Not asking, processing aloud. 3 jurisdictions, provisionally. The 4th is moving slower. The extradition request. Submitted. Timeline. Possibly longer. She held his gaze. You know all of this. I know the official timeline, so, he said. I'm trying to determine what the unofficial timeline looks like. She looked at him. I came here to deliver something, she said. She pulled an envelope from her jacket. Paper, sealed, civilian. Held it out. He looked at it, didn't take it. What is it, he said. The Grayfield investigation file. The reopened version. Specifically the section that establishes your direct role in the intelligence compromise that resulted in 4 operators killed and 1 listed as KIA. She kept her arm extended. Reyes is holding it. It publishes in 48 hours unless I tell her otherwise. I'm giving you the advance copy as a professional courtesy. A pause. Professional courtesy, he said. You were a general for 22 years, she said. You should see what the charge sheet looks like before it's public. He took the envelope. He held it without opening it. His hands were steady. She noted that, gave it appropriate weight. A man capable of holding a charge sheet without visible reaction was a man who'd been rehearsing for this moment, which meant he'd known, on some level, that this moment was coming. You could have sent this, he said. You didn't need to be here. No, she agreed. Then why? She thought about the honest answer. Because the people who operated under you deserved someone to look you in the eye on their behalf, she said, and I'm the only one available. The sea behind her, the pale light, the envelope in his hands and the weight of what was in it. You were a captain, he said. Grayfield was 5 years ago. Everything since then. He stopped. Everything since then was me doing what needed to be done without the institutional support that you took away, she said. Her voice was even, not heated. She'd had 5 years to process the heat of this, and what remained was not anger in any form she'd describe as useful. It was something colder and more permanent. You decided I was an acceptable cost. I decided you were wrong. That's the whole story. He looked at her for a long time. You're better than I gave you credit for, he said. I know, she said. She turned and walked back up the beach. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear him standing in the same position, the paper envelope in his hands, the sea wind, the specific quality of a man who was alone with what he'd built and what it had cost. Behind her, she heard him open the envelope. She was on a flight back 2 days later. Reyes published the Grayfield section on schedule. Cross's legal team issued a statement through an intermediary that described the allegations as without merit and indicated a formal legal response was forthcoming. 3 legal analysts speaking to 3 different networks assessed the documentation as significant and the formal response as unlikely to be sustainable against it. Hendrick sent her the assessment summary at 35,000 feet over open ocean. She read it and put the phone away and looked at the dark outside the window, the absence of land below, the specific suspension of being between places. She thought about the beach, the envelope, the expression on Cross's face when she turned and walked away, the expression she hadn't seen but had heard, in the quality of the silence behind her, in the sound of paper. She thought about whether it had been worth going. Yes, unambiguously yes, for the reasons she'd stated on the beach, but also for a reason she hadn't stated, which was simpler. She'd needed to see that he was a person and not a structure. 5 years of operating against the architecture of his decisions had made him into something abstract, a pattern of choices, a network of consequences. He'd needed to be human-sized before she could put him down. He was. He was human-sized and frightened and capable of opening an envelope with steady hands in order to not show that he was frightened, and eventually, not today, not in the next months, but eventually, he was going to sit in a room with the weight of what he'd built on one side of a table and the law on the other. That would have to be enough. She slept the rest of the flight without dreaming. She was in the country for 3 days before she contacted Voss. Not avoidance. She had the Grayfield witness debrief with the JAG officer, which took 2 full sessions, and a separate meeting with a civilian oversight official who needed her account of the Eclipse documentation chain and was professional enough not to ask the questions he knew she wouldn't answer. She ate regular meals. She slept in a bed. She had the knee examined by a doctor who was not part of any military medical system and who told her the damage was manageable with rest and specific treatment, which she knew, and that she'd been not resting it adequately for what appeared to be an extended period, which she also knew. On the fourth day, she drove to the facility where Voss was completing his formal debrief sessions. He came out to the parking area when she sent the message. He was in civilian clothes. Someone had clearly sourced a basic kit for him, nothing that fit exactly right. The universal condition of clothes provided rather than chosen. His wrists were still bandaged, but more lightly than before. He looked like a man who had slept more than 3 hours in a row recently and was recalibrating to that reality. He saw the car, saw her behind the wheel. He got in. She drove without a destination for a few minutes, through the facility's perimeter and onto the road that ran east through farmland. Gray winter light, flat fields, the specific visual quiet of landscape that had been under snow recently and was waiting for more. Cross, he said. Handled. Define handled. He has the full Grayfield file. Reyes published it. His accounts are frozen in 3 jurisdictions and the 4th is moving. She looked at the road. The extradition will take time, but the financial architecture is collapsed, and the legal case is on record, and he's sitting in a coastal house with 2 security guards and a paper envelope, knowing that the only direction things are moving is toward him. Voss was quiet for a moment. "You went there," he said. "Yes." "You could have sent Reyes the file from here." "Yes." He didn't push it. He looked at the farmland. "The Grayfield testimony," he said. "The JAG officer says you were thorough." "It's a thorough situation." "She also says you declined to submit a formal reinstatement request." She didn't respond immediately. "The dead woman option has been useful," she said. "A reinstated captain with a service record comes with oversight and reporting requirements and a chain of command." "So does a reinstated captain," he said. "But so does everyone who does the kind of work you do. The question is whether the chain of command is one you trust." She thought about that. "Trusting a chain of command requires evidence," she said. "I've been collecting evidence about chains of command for 5 years. The evidence base is mixed." "That's a fair assessment." He looked at her. "I'm going to be in a different position when the formal proceedings are concluded. Different posting, different authority, level. The oversight committee that Cross-chaired is going to be restructured." He paused. "I'll have input into who leads it." She understood what he was saying. Not an offer, exactly. A statement of future fact, with an implication attached. "You're not asking me anything," she said. "No," he said, "I'm not. I'm telling you that the thing you've been doing without institutional support is something that the institution is going to need done by someone it can trust, and that the options for who that someone could be are limited." He looked back at the road. "I'm not asking." "You don't respond well to being asked." She thought that was probably accurate. "The Grayfield team," she said. "The 4 who were actually KIA. Not me. Part of the reopened investigation. Full honors processing is being initiated. Their families will be notified with the accurate record rather than the operational cover story." She held the road with both hands. Outside, the fields were the brown-gray of winter, dormant, waiting for whatever came next to come. "That matters more than my reinstatement," she said. "I know. Make sure it doesn't get buried in the procedural volume." "I will." She drove for another few minutes without speaking. "Maya's birthday is in March," Voss said. "She's going to be 8. "I know. You mentioned her." "I didn't mention her birthday." "No." "Elena wants to have something small, family, maybe a few of my people who Maya knows." He paused. Elena said, that if the woman who came into that cell block wanted to come, she'd be welcome. She said that's a standing invitation and it doesn't expire. She didn't answer right away. She thought about a 7-year-old who intended to be either a marine biologist or a jazz drummer, and possibly both. She thought about the farmhouse stove and the specific light it made on Voss's face, and the Christmas pancakes that had been waiting, and the 2 words he'd said in the doorway of the medical room. "Come back." "Tell Elena thank you," she said. "That's not a no." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the road. But she was aware of him looking, and she let it happen, because some things you didn't deflect when you were tired of deflecting. She turned the car around at a crossroads and drove back toward the facility. 6 months later, Blackridge was a different kind of place. The formal proceedings against Adrian Cross concluded in his absence. The extradition had taken 4 months, not months plural, in the indefinite sense, but 4 specific months of legal process in a country that eventually ran out of procedural delay options when 3 of its own financial institutions became implicated in the asset movement. He arrived back in country on a Tuesday in late May. There were cameras. He walked through an airport with his hands in front of him and his face doing nothing, which was the last time his face got to make that choice for itself. Marcus Vail testified for 11 days. The testimony was classified in portions and public in others, and the public portions were enough. He received a negotiated sentence that the editorial boards of 2 major newspapers described as too lenient, and that the families of the soldiers who had died in manufactured conflict described in terms that were not printable. Vail himself said nothing public. He had said what he intended to say in the room with Voss, and he appeared to have accepted the weight of what that had cost him. Sergeant Talia Wren received a commendation for the action that had preserved the server hardware. She requested a transfer to a non-combat administrative posting. The request was approved. Reginald Harlan, the administrative layer that connected Cross's financial architecture to the Eclipse procurement mechanism, was located in a neighboring country and cooperated with investigators in exchange for considerations that were not disclosed. He was unremarkable in every way, which was the point of using him. General Ethan Voss returned to active duty in a restructured oversight role that required Senate confirmation, which he received with a margin that surprised no one who'd followed the proceedings. He made 2 public statements about the Eclipse investigation. The second one included a paragraph about the soldiers who had died in circumstances manufactured for someone else's profit, and he read it without looking up from the paper, and when he finished, he folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket and didn't say anything else. The reporters who covered it said that was the moment. That was the image that ran. The Grayfield team's families received formal notifications with corrected records in late February. There were 4 ceremonies in 4 cities on 4 separate days. Each family received an accurate account of what their person had done and what had been done to them, rather than the operational cover story that had stood for 5 years. None of the ceremonies were public. They didn't need to be. Catherine Lane remained officially deceased. The woman who had been Catherine Lane remained active, in a capacity that did not appear in any directory, under an oversight structure that reported to a committee chaired by a general who understood the difference between accountability and visibility. She went to Maya Voss's 8th birthday party in March. It was small. Family, a few people who mattered, a kitchen that smelled like something good had been happening in it all day. Maya was the kind of 8-year-old who asked the specific questions that made adults look at each other across the room. She asked the woman with the dark jacket and the careful eyes whether she had a dog, and when the woman said no, Maya said that was a shame and offered to share hers, which was a 14-pound terrier mix named Sergeant, who had immediately commandeered the woman's lap and was declining to be moved. Elena Voss brought 2 mugs of coffee to the back porch where the woman had gone to stand in the cold March air with the terrier under one arm, looking at the yard. "He talks about you," Elena said. She handed over a mug. "Not constantly, but when it matters." The woman held the coffee. "He doesn't need to," she said. "No," Elena said, "but he does anyway. That's the kind of man he is." She looked at the yard. "Thank you for what you did. I know you didn't do it for us. I know you had your own reasons, but thank you anyway." The woman looked at the yard too. The early March light, the brown grass at the edge of coming back to life, the small terrier now chasing something invisible near the fence line with the unqualified commitment of an animal for whom the present moment was the only moment. "He's a good man," the woman said. "Good men should come home." Elena was quiet for a moment. "So should good women," she said. The woman didn't answer, but she stayed for the rest of the party. She ate the cake. She let Maya show her the jazz drumming practice kit in the basement with the serious attention of a child who understood this was important, and she listened to Maya play 3 beats she'd learned and 1 she'd invented, and she said, "That one's yours," about the invented one. And Maya looked at her with the specific expression of a child receiving information they intended to keep. She stayed until the last of the guests left. She left after Voss, because someone needed to be last, and it was easier for her to be last than to say goodbye to a family in a lit kitchen while the March dark was outside. On the drive back, she thought about the question Voss had asked in the farmhouse corridor. "What do you want?" She still didn't have a clean answer, But she thought about the terrier on her lap, and the coffee on the porch, and the birthday cake, and the jazz drumming, and she thought that maybe the clean answer wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that she'd been in a room full of people who knew she existed, and none of them had tried to erase her. That was something. That was actually quite a lot. She drove home. The word home applied loosely to an address she'd had for 3 months and hadn't yet decided about. And on the table when she came in was her phone with one message from a number she recognized as a new relay for a contact she'd been developing in a different region, a message that said 4 words about a situation she'd been tracking peripherally, and that required, in the assessment of the contact, the specific kind of attention she provided. She read it once, set the phone down, made coffee, picked the phone back up, and somewhere in the distance, if you knew how to look, you could see the shape of a person who had been erased, choosing again and again to remain. The world will always need people who refuse to stay buried, not because it's safe or celebrated or rewarded, but because someone has to stand between what is and what's being hidden. And the ones who do it best are often the ones no one ever thought to look for.